Did a dish ever change a man's soul? Not merely please his palate or fill his belly, but fundamentally alter the very fiber of his being. In the great kitchens of the Baron of Winchester, Master Cook Thomas believed it could. For him, a sauce was not just a sauce, it was a testament, a story told in fat and salt and thyme. A roast was not just meat, it was a monument to power, its crackling skin a shield against the rot and ruin that lay beyond the castle walls. He was an artist, and this steamy, chaotic world of hearth fire and chopping blocks was his studio. It was the autumn of 1347. The harvest had been gathered, and the Baron's larders were swollen with the fat of the land. Tonight, Baron Richard de Burgh, a man whose appetites were as vast and cruel as his lands, was hosting the Earl of Arundel. The alliance was crucial, and the language of its negotiation would be food. Thomas, his face slick with sweat and his dark hair plastered to his brow, moved through the kitchen like a phantom conductor. His voice was a low, sharp current in the river of noise. "More butter in the pottage, John. Are you trying to serve the Earl dishwater?" he barked, dipping a spoon in, tasting, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. "And where is the saffron for the swan? God's teeth. Do you think it grows on trees?" His hands, a roadmap of pale burned scars and calluses, moved with a grace that belied their strength. He plated a delicate fish pie, the crust a golden lattice, and felt a familiar surge of pride. It was perfect. It was beauty. It was order carved from the chaos of raw things. This was his purpose. To create food so sublime it could make a man forget, for a moment, that he was mortal. But as the great platters began their procession to the great hall, a ghost slipped through the steam to stand at his elbow. It was Alara, a scullery maid no older than 16, her face pale and her knuckles raw from the lye soap. She was often there, a silent, watchful presence at the edge of his world. "Master Cook," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sizzle of the spits. Thomas didn't turn. "What is it, girl?" "We are serving the Baron, not entertaining idle hands." "It is not for me, sir. It's the herbs. In the garden." She gestured vaguely towards the high walls. "I saw them. The comfrey and the yarrow. The Baron's herbs are for the Baron's table. You know this. It's for my brother, Master Cook. For Luke. He has a fever in his chest. It rattles him when he breathes." Her voice was tight with a desperation that cut through the kitchen's heat. An old woman in the village said a poultice, a broth. Thomas finally turned. His irritation pricked by a sharper, colder feeling. He looked at her properly. At the frayed hem of her tunic, the smudges of soot on her cheek, the sheer terror in her young eyes. And in them, he saw it. The ghost of another face. A smaller one, with eyes just as wide, wasting away in a hovel that smelled of damp earth and despair. His sister, 20 years gone. He flinched, the memory a physical blow. The kitchen, with its abundance, its roaring fires, its extravagant waste, suddenly felt obscene. A pound of the saffron he had just used for the swan could have fed her village for a month. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in his gut. The Baron was a man of fickle tempers. To be caught taking anything, even a few common herbs, was to risk a flogging, or worse, dismissal. To be cast out from these walls was to be cast back into the world he had so desperately escaped. He hardened his face, turning it back into the mask of the Master Cook. "The garden is the Baron's," he said, his voice flat. He picked up a ladle, his hands suddenly heavy. "Pray for your brother. The church is generous with prayers. Now, get back to the washing." He did not see her face as she scurried away, but he felt the weight of her silence long after she was gone. He looked at the next course, a magnificent boar's head. Its tusks gleaming, an apple stuffed in its mouth. It was a masterpiece of culinary architecture. It was a monument. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt the overwhelming urge to smash it to the floor. That night, sleep offered Thomas no refuge. He was back in the hovel, the winter of 27 howling outside. He was 14 again, his own hunger a dull, constant ache, but it was nothing compared to the sharp agony of watching his sister, Anya, fade. He remembered the desperate search for anything to eat, boiled shoe leather, bitter acorns ground into a gritty paste that tore at their insides. He remembered his mother's face, a mask of hollowed-out grief. The dream shifted, and he was in the monastery kitchen where he had found his salvation. Brother Michael, a cook with a face as round and kind as a loaf of bread, had pressed a warm heel of manchet into his hand. "The body is a temple, my boy," the monk had said, his voice rumbling. "But a temple must have foundations. Eat." The taste of that bread, soft, rich, real, was the taste of life itself. It was the moment he understood that food was not just sustenance, it was grace. It was the moment he had sworn to master it. He awoke with a gasp, the phantom taste of that bread still on his tongue, the scent of the hovel's damp rot in his nostrils. The opulence of his own small chamber within the castle walls, the wool blanket, the straw-stuffed mattress, felt like a betrayal. The next day, the guilt was a physical presence, a bitter aftertaste to every fine thing he sampled. He watched from a high window as Baron de Burgh practiced his falconry on the castle green. The Baron laughed as the bird stooped, a flash of feathered death, and tore a dove from the sky. The casual, thoughtless cruelty of it resonated with Thomas's own act of cowardice. Later, in the great hall, he supervised the clearing of the midday meal. The Baron, displeased with some news brought by a messenger, had risen from the table in a temper, leaving a whole roasted capon, stuffed with figs and herbs, virtually untouched. "Take it away," the Baron's steward said with a flick of his wrist. "Give it to the dogs." Thomas watched as the magnificent bird, a dish that had taken him 3 hours to prepare, was scraped unceremoniously onto a wooden platter destined for the kennel. 3 hours of his life, his art. Enough food to feed Alara's family for 2 days. He felt a rage so pure and hot it nearly choked him. That evening, he moved with purpose. After the kitchen fires were banked and the last of the servants had trudged off to their pallets, he worked in the low light of a single tallow candle. He took a small loaf of yesterday's bread, too coarse for the Baron's table, but a luxury beyond imagining in the village. He carved a thick slice of hard cheese and wrapped it with the bread in a clean piece of linen. He filled a small flask with the rich, gelatinous stock from the soup bones. It was simple food. Peasant food, elevated by its quality. Life-giving food. He found Alara by the well in the outer bailey, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He pressed the bundle into her hands without a word. She looked from the bundle to his face, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Master Cook." "For your brother," Thomas muttered, unable to meet her gaze. "The stock is nourishing. See that he drinks it warm." He turned and walked away before she could reply, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a small act, a foolish and dangerous one. But it was the first time in 20 years he hadn't felt like a ghost. The smuggling became a ritual, a secret penance performed in the shadows of the castle's gluttony. A few eggs here, a bowl of thick pottage there, a piece of salted pork carefully trimmed from a larger joint. Each time he gave the food to Alara, he would ask after Luke. The news was never good. The fever held fast. The cough was a deep, wet rattle that stole the boy's breath. "He is weak, Master Cook," Alara told him one evening, her voice thin. "He has no strength to fight." Her words struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. No strength to fight, it was what the village elder had said of his sister, Anya, just before the end. The past was not just haunting him. It was replaying itself, and he was being offered a part he had been too weak to take before. His visits to the kitchen garden became more frequent. He was no longer just the Baron's cook, he was a student again, remembering the lessons Brother Michael had taught him about the properties of herbs. He gathered comfort for poultices, thyme to be steeped in a tea to ease the chest, garlic to fight the sickness in the blood. He was treading a dangerous line, his knowledge of healing a strange and suspicious thing in a man of his station. One night, Driven by a need he didn't fully understand, he convinced Alara to lead him to the village. The transition from the stone-walled security of the castle to the village was jarring. The air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke, human waste, and damp misery. They navigated lanes of thick, sucking mud to a hovel that seemed to sag into the earth. Inside, the darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by the faint orange glow of a few embers in a central hearth. The single room was crowded with sleeping bodies, the air heavy with the sounds of their breathing. In a corner, on a pallet of dirty straw, lay Luke. He was a boy of perhaps 10, but his face was gaunt and old, his skin stretched tight over his bones. Each breath was a ragged, painful struggle. As Thomas looked down at him, the face of his sister superimposed itself over the boy's. The same hollow eyes. The same fragile pulse beating at the base of a thin throat. He had thought himself a master of his world, a king in his kitchen. He saw now that his kingdom was a cage, its bars gilded with the fat of other people's suffering. The art he practiced, the beauty he created, it meant nothing here. Here, a simple bowl of warm broth was worth more than all the gilded swans in Christendom. He left the hovel with a cold resolve settling in his soul. His fear of the Baron hadn't vanished, but it had been dwarfed by a larger, more profound fear, the fear of failing again. The catalyst for change arrived on the back of a lathered horse. A messenger brought news that the Baron's tedious negotiations had been successful. His niece would be betrothed to the Earl of Arundel's son, cementing an alliance that would make de Burgh one of the most powerful men in the south of England. There will be a feast, the Baron announced, his voice ringing through the great hall. He was a man transformed, his usual sullen demeanor replaced by a triumphant fire. A feast to make the angels weep with envy. Thomas. Thomas stepped forward, bowing his head. This will be your masterpiece, the Baron declared, his eyes gleaming. You will create a dish that will be spoken of for 100 years. Something no one has ever seen. Something that speaks of my power. Do not fail me. The pressure was immense. The entire kitchen was thrown into a state of controlled frenzy. Exotic ingredients were ordered from London and Southampton. Spices worth a night's ransom arrived under armed guard. Thomas worked day and night, his mind a whirlwind of recipes and techniques. He planned a dish of absurd complexity, a great pottage of peacock and lark, spiced with grains of paradise and cubeb pepper, encased in a gilded pastry coffin from which, when cut, live birds would be released. It was a subtlety, a culinary trick designed to inspire awe and envy. It was the pinnacle of his art, and the very thought of it filled him with self-loathing. As he worked, other news trickled into the castle, news far more significant than the Baron's political triumphs. Travelers from the south, merchants from the ports, spoke of a sickness. A great pestilence that had emptied towns in Italy and France. They spoke of black swellings in the groin and armpit, of a swift and certain death that spared neither rich nor poor. The castle's physician, a man of timid learning, dismissed it as rumor and miasma, bad air from the continent. But Thomas, who had seen famine up close, knew the scent of true catastrophe. It was a low, cold hum beneath the surface of the world, a note of dread that only the unfortunate could hear. The night of the feast arrived. The castle blazed with light, a beacon of defiant opulence in the darkening world. The great hall was a sea of velvet and jewels. Thomas stood in the wings of the kitchen, his senses overwhelmed. The scent of roasted meats, of mulled wine, of beeswax and perfume, mingled into a suffocating cloud. His masterpiece, the gilded coffin, sat on a great silver platter, ready for its grand entrance. He felt a flicker of the old pride. It was magnificent. It was absurd. Just as the steward called for the next course, Alara appeared at his side. Her face was a mess of tears and dirt. "Master Cook," she choked out, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's Luke. He's going. The priest is with him now." The world narrowed to the space between them. The noise of the feast faded. The scent of the roast disappeared. All he could hear was the ragged sound of the boys breathing in the hovel. All he could see was his sister's face. He looked at the gilded coffin. The symbol of his life's work, his ambition, his success, his cowardice. He looked at Alara's desperate face, the symbol of his past, his failure, his one chance at redemption. In that moment, the master cook died. And Thomas was reborn. He moved without thinking, his body possessed by a purpose so clear and absolute it felt like a religious vision. He shoved the great platter of the peacock coffin into the hands of a stunned undercook. "Serve the boar again," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He turned back to his station, his hands flying. He grabbed the small, precious pouch of saffron, the jar of ground ginger from the Levant, the richest, most clarified capon broth he had reserved for the Baron's own private soup. These were not ingredients, they were weapons. Saffron to fight the fever, ginger to warm the chest, the broth to give strength where there was none. He poured them into a small pot, stirring with a concentration more intense than any he had ever given a royal sauce. He added a spoonful of honey for energy and a pinch of salt to hold the water in the body. It was a recipe born of desperation and deep, forgotten knowledge. When it was done, he poured the steaming, fragrant liquid, a liquid the color of pure gold, into a simple wooden bowl. He strode out of the kitchen, past the gawking servants, and into the dazzling light of the great hall. Heads turned. The music faltered. He walked directly towards the high table, the humble bowl held before him like a holy relic. Baron de Berg stared, his mouth agape. "Thomas? What is the meaning of this? Where is my subtlety?" the Baron roared, his face purpling. Thomas did not look at him. He stopped before the high table and held up the bowl. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried through the silenced hall with the weight of prophecy. "My lord," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the gluttonous lords and ladies. "You ask for a dish that speaks of power." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "There is no power greater than life. This is not for your table." He turned, ignoring the Baron's sputtering rage, and placed the bowl carefully onto a serving tray held by a terrified page. "Take this to the village," he commanded the boy, his voice gentle but firm. "To the hovel of the weaver, John. For his son." He then faced the Baron. For the first time, he met his master's gaze without fear. He saw not a powerful lord, but a weak, frightened man, insulated by wealth but terrified of anything he could not control. "I am done serving death," Thomas said quietly. And with that, he turned his back on the feast, on his kitchen, on his entire life, and walked out of the great hall, leaving a trail of stunned silence and the faint, life-giving aroma of ginger and saffron in his wake. The Baron's retribution was swift but unimaginative. Thomas was not flogged or imprisoned, that would have given the incident more weight than de Berg was willing to acknowledge. He was simply declared mad, stripped of his title, and cast out of the castle gates at dawn with nothing but the clothes on his back. As the great portcullis slammed shut behind him, Thomas felt not loss, but a profound and shattering sense of release. The air of the world, for all its dangers, tasted clean. He found his way to the village. It was a place he had only ever observed from the castle walls, a collection of brown smudges on the landscape. Now, its reality was visceral, the squelching mud that sucked at his worn shoes, the acrid smoke that stung his eyes, the omnipresent smell of poverty. He found Alara outside the weaver's hovel. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a fragile, bewildered hope. "He lives," she whispered as Thomas approached. "The fever broke near dawn. He breathes easy, Master Cook. He breathes." Luke was asleep, his breathing deep and even for the first time in weeks. Looking at the boy, alive and warm in the squalid hut, Thomas felt a sense of fulfillment that no applause from a feasting hall had ever given him. It was not a triumph, it was a quiet, solid thing. A foundation. He had expected to be an outcast, a strange figure from the castle. But news, carried by the page he had entrusted with the bowl, had preceded him. He was not the Baron's disgraced cook, he was the man who had defied a lord for a sick child. In this world of rigid hierarchy, such an act was unthinkable, legendary. He was met not with suspicion, but with a quiet, reverent awe. His new life began. His hands, once accustomed to the delicate work of shaping pastry and clarifying sauces, learned the rhythm of splitting wood and grinding coarse barley. His palate, trained to discern the finest nuances of wine and spice, learned the taste of necessity, the bitter tang of foraged greens, the earthy comfort of black bread, the watery thinness of peasant pottage. He was often hungry. But he was never empty. Then, as the winter deepened, the rumors from the south became a horrifying reality. The pestilence arrived. It came not as a conquering army, but as a whisper. A fever, a single black swelling that appeared overnight. The village priest was among the first to die, leaving the community terrified and leaderless. Panic gave way to a grim, shuddered despair. But Thomas, who had faced down a baron, would not be cowed by a plague. He had no power to stop it, but he had knowledge. The knowledge of a cook, a healer, a survivor. "We cannot fight the sickness," he told the gathered villagers. His voice steady in the flickering torchlight, "but we can fight the weakness that invites it in." He organized them. He taught them which wild herbs had power, feverfew and garlic, rosemary and thyme. He showed them how to make a potent, nourishing broth from fish heads and vegetable scraps, stretching their meager resources. He instituted a ruthless hygiene, insisting that water be boiled, hands washed, and the sick be kept separate but cared for. He turned the entire village into a kitchen, a great simmering pot of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Many died. The toll was terrible, a relentless scythe cutting through families. But many also lived. They survived through sheer, stubborn resilience, fueled by warm broth and a shared purpose. One evening, a rider from the castle, his face hidden by a cloth mask, came to the edge of the village. He brought news. The Black Death had breached the castle walls. Its halls of stone, meant to keep the world out, had become a perfect trap. The Baron, Richard de Burgh, weakened by a lifetime of rich food and indolence, had been one of the first to succumb. His great feast had been his last. Thomas felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. The Baron was simply another victim of a world that was being torn apart. His personal enemy had been revealed for what he always was, irrelevant in the face of true catastrophe. The plague eventually passed, leaving a shattered, emptier world in its wake. The fields lay fallow, the villages were quiet. But in the barony of Montfort, a small community had endured. Thomas remained. He never cooked for a lord again. His art found its true and final form not in gilded peacocks or elaborate subtleties, but in the simple, sacred act of feeding people. He taught the children how to find nourishing roots, the women how to preserve the harvest, the men how to make a fire that would keep a pot simmering through the night. He had lost everything he once valued, his title, his comfort, his art. But in the ashes of that life, he had found something far more precious. He had faced the ghost of his past and, this time, had not turned away. He had learned that the most profound dish is not the one served on silver to the powerful, but the one shared from a wooden bowl with the hungry, a simple, defiant offering of warmth and life in the midst of a cold, dark world. His soul, at last, was fed. Story 2. As requested, here is the complete story based on the provided materials, fulfilling the prompt's requirements. The dead tasted of limestone dust. Ka knew the flavor intimately. It was the first taste of the morning, a chalky film that coated his tongue as he woke in the pre-dawn gray. It was the seasoning on his midday meal of coarse bread and onions, a grit that ground between his molars with a sound like miniature landslides. And it was the last thing he felt at night, a fine powder settling deep in his lungs, a promise of the silicosis that would one day claim him, just as it had his father. Today, the dust was particularly thick. It hung in the air of the passage, a shimmering haze in the weak, flickering light of the linseed oil lamps. Each strike of the flint chisels farther down the tunnel sent a fresh cloud billowing towards him, clinging to the sweat on his bare back and arms, turning his skin into a pale, ghostly canvas. His world was a narrow tube of rock, a man-made gap boring deep into the Theban hills. Destined to be the eternal home of a man he would never meet, the Vizier Passer, a name as distant and abstract as the gods themselves. Ka's job was not the noble work. Not anymore. He didn't carve the delicate, intricate figures of the gods or the elegant lines of hieroglyphs that would guide the vizier's soul. That required 2 good eyes. His task was cruder. With a copper chisel blunted from overuse and a heavy wooden mallet, he chipped away at the rock face, squaring a corner for the false door that would one day fool tomb robbers. It was mindless, punishing work. Chip, chip, pry. The rhythm was a dull metronome counting down the moments of his life. His left eye, the milky, sightless one, throbbed with a familiar ache. It always did in the close, stale air of the tombs. He tilted his head, favoring his right eye, his vision a flat, one-dimensional plane. It made judging depth a constant guesswork, and more than once he'd brought the mallet down too close to his own hand. The scar on his knuckles, a pale white line against his sun-darkened skin, was proof. Are you praying to the stone, Ka? Or has the dust finally turned your brain to mud? The voice, slick with contempt, echoed down the passage. Ka didn't need to look. He could feel the presence of Baku, the overseer, a man whose shadow seemed to carry its own weight. He straightened up, his back protesting with a series of sharp clicks. Baku stood with his hands on his hips, his stout frame filling the narrow space. His shaven head gleamed with sweat, and his clean, pleated linen kilt was a stark white accusation against the grime that covered everyone else. He was a man who had climbed out of the dust by learning how to wield a whip better than a chisel. The corner is nearly square. Overseer, Ka said, his voice a low rasp. Baku stepped closer, running a hand along the wall. He picked at a seam in the rock with a thick finger. Nearly is not done. The vizier's Ka will not wait for you to finish your naps. Or is your bad eye making you see straight lines where there are none? The familiar insult landed with a dull thud. It was Baku's favorite weapon. He believed, as many did, that Ka's ruined eye was a mark of Set, a sign of chaos, a harbinger of bad luck. It will be done by the time Ra's barge meets the horizon, Ka replied, turning back to his work, a clear dismissal. He could feel Baku's stare on his back, hot and heavy. See that it is, Baku sneered, before turning and moving down the tunnel, his sandals scuffing on the rocky floor. The rest of you, work. Do you want the pharaoh's displeasure to fall upon this place? The chiseling resumed. Its pace a little more frantic now. Ka closed his good eye for a moment, letting the rhythmic tapping wash over him. He hated Baku. But more than that, he hated the truth in his words. His eye did make the work harder. It had taken everything from him. Once, he had been the apprentice, the one whose hands could make stone birds look as if they might take flight. Now he was this, a beast of burden. A digger, a hauler. A man marked. The horn sounded from the mouth of the valley, a long, mournful blast that signaled the end of the day. The sound was a physical release. Tools were lowered, backs were straightened, and a collective groan of exhaustion and relief filled the tomb. The workers began to shuffle out, their bodies leaving ghostly imprints in the dusty air, their faces pale masks under layers of white powder. Ka gathered his chisel and mallet. His movements slow and deliberate. The walk back to the village was another trial. Out of the cool dark of the tomb and into the furnace of the late afternoon sun. The light was a physical blow, making him squint his good eye. The heat radiated up from the valley floor, a shimmering, distorting wave that made the distant cliffs tremble. The Valley of the Kings was a sacred place, the gateway to eternity for the mighty. But for the men who toiled here, it was just a sun-scorched, waterless basin of rock and death. He joined the silent column of men trekking the winding path back toward Setmaat, the place of truth, the village the rest of Egypt simply called the tomb. It was a city in miniature, walled and isolated, home to the finest artisans and laborers in the kingdom. They were the keepers of secrets, the builders of eternal houses. They were fed by the pharaoh, clothed by the pharaoh, and watched by the pharaoh's guards. It was a privileged life, they were told. A gilded cage. Ka walked with his head down, ignoring the chatter around him. The other men gave him a wide berth. Some out of pity, others out of superstition. He preferred it this way. Their talk was of beer, of women, of a disputed game of senate. It was the talk of men who had not yet had their hopes ground into dust. As he passed the village gates, the smells changed. The dry, mineral scent of the valley gave way to the richer, more human smells of cooking fires, unwashed bodies, donkey dung, and the faint, sweet perfume of flowers from a household shrine. The houses were crammed together, small mud brick structures sharing walls, their doorways opening onto narrow, winding alleys. His own home was at the edge of the village, a small, two-room dwelling that baked like an oven in the day and grew cold in the night. He pushed aside the reed mat that served as a door and stepped into the dim interior. Ka. The voice was thin, fragile, like a dry leaf. He saw her sitting on a mat in the corner, a small figure wrapped in a linen sheet despite the heat. Anapi. His sister. "I am here," he said, his voice softening. He moved to the large water jar in the corner and ladled some water into a cup, his hands clumsy with exhaustion. He brought it to her. Her own hands trembled as she took it. She was 14, but the illness had given her the frail transparency of someone much older. Her eyes, large and dark in her thin face, followed his every move. "Was it a hard day?" she asked, her words punctuated by a soft, dry cough that seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. "All days are hard," he said, trying to keep the bitterness from his tone. He sat on the floor opposite her. "But the stone is weaker than I am. For now." She tried to smile, but it turned into another series of coughs, a deep, rattling sound that shook her small frame. Ka's heart clenched into a tight, painful knot. Each cough was like a grain of sand falling in the hourglass of her life. He watched her struggle for breath, her chest rising and falling shallowly. The dust. The damn dust that filled this village, that settled on everything, that they all breathed from the moment they were born. It made the strong weak and the weak. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "Breathe, little bird. Just breathe." She finally caught her breath, leaning her head back against the mud brick wall. "The healer came today," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. Ka stiffened. What did he want? The temple healers never came unbidden. Their services were not gifts. He said the herbal poultice is not enough. He said my spirit is weak, that a demon of the air has taken root in my chest. She took a shaky breath. He said only a true amulet can drive it out. An ivory charm of the god Bes, the protector. Blessed in the temple. Ka felt a cold dread seep into his bones. Colder than any tomb. He knew what such things cost. He had seen the nobles and high officials buy them, trading small fortunes for a piece of carved bone or stone, a whispered prayer. "And the price for this protection?" he asked, his voice flat. Anapi wouldn't meet his eye. She stared at the cup in her hands. He said, 5 deben of silver, Ka. 5 deben. The number was an obscenity. It was more than he could earn in 2 years of labor. Even if he didn't eat. It was an impossible sum, a polite way of passing a death sentence. He looked at his sister, at her fragile hope, at the fear lurking behind it. He saw the healer's cold, transactional eyes, the system that weighed a life in silver. And in that moment, looking at the only person in the world who saw him as more than a broken man, a new thought, sharp and terrifying as a shard of flint, began to take shape in the darkness of his mind. The days that followed were a slow, suffocating descent into hell. Anapi's condition worsened. The dry cough became wet and ragged, each breath a struggle that left her gasping and slick with sweat. She rarely rose from her mat now, and the small rations of bread and beer Ka brought her went mostly untouched. The life was seeping out of her, slow drop by slow drop, and Ka was forced to stand by and watch. He worked with a ferocity that startled the other men and even earned a rare, grudging silence from Baku. He hammered and chipped and hauled, his muscles screaming in protest, trying to exorcise his helplessness through punishing labor. But every night he returned to the same suffocating reality, the small, dark room, the sound of his sister's labored breathing, and the crushing weight of those 5 deben of silver. It was a mountain he could never hope to climb. He sold the last of his father's good copper chisels, the ones he'd kept hidden away, remnants of a life he might have had. The merchant, a sly man with eyes that missed nothing, gave him a pittance for them. With the coins, Ka bought a special honey and herb paste from a woman in the village known for her folk remedies. It did nothing. Anapi's fever climbed higher. Desperation was a physical thing, a sour taste in his mouth and a constant, thrumming anxiety in his gut. It was in this state of mind that the terrible idea, once a fleeting shadow, began to solidify, to take on form and weight. He was working in the tomb of the vizier Passeer, but the burial of another official, a minor scribe of the treasury named Nebaman, had just been completed a week prior. Ka had been on the crew that sealed the outer passage. He knew its layout. He knew it was a modest tomb for an official of Nebaman's rank, unlikely to be filled with the mountains of gold of a prince, but it would not be empty. There would be funerary goods. Furniture, linens, painted chests, and small, precious objects meant to serve the dead in the field of reeds. Alabaster jars filled with perfumed unguents, faience bowls, perhaps a pectoral of semi-precious stones. Things that carried value. The thought was sacrilege. To rob a tomb was to condemn the dead to a second, eternal death, to strip them of their name and their provisions for the afterlife. It was a crime the gods did not forgive. The punishment, if caught, was impalement, a slow and agonizing end under the public gaze. But what was the threat of a painful death compared to the certainty of Anapis? What was the wrath of the gods in the next life compared to the torment of his own conscience in this one? He began to watch. To plan. His work became a cover for his reconnaissance. While hauling debris from Passeer's tomb, he would take the long path, passing the sealed entrance to Nebaman's final resting place. It was tucked away in a less visited spur of the valley. He noted the patterns of the Medjay guards. They were diligent, but their patrols were predictable. They focused on the grander, royal tombs, paying less attention to the resting places of lesser men. One afternoon, feigning a sudden illness, he slipped away from the work site. He found a high ledge overlooking Nebaman's tomb and lay flat on the hot rock, watching. He sketched the layout of the outer passages in the dust with a stick, his memory of the construction sharp and clear. The main burial chamber was behind 2 sealed doors and a rubble-filled corridor. Difficult, but not impossible. He knew how the plaster seals were faked by the masons to look stronger than they were. He knew which stones were the weakest. He had built these things. He knew how to unbuild them. The internal battle was relentless. At night, he lay on his mat, listening to Anapi's faint whimpers, and his resolve would harden. This was for her. He would face any punishment, any god, for her. But in the tomb, surrounded by the painted eyes of Osiris and Anubis, his fear would return. The images on the walls were not mere decoration to him, they were living truths. He saw himself in the hall of Ma'at, his own heart placed on the scales against the feather of truth. He saw it sink, heavy with the sin he was contemplating. He saw the jaws of Ammit, the devourer, opening to consume his soul for eternity. One evening, Baku stopped him as he was leaving the valley. The overseer's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You have the look of a man with a heavy spirit, Ka," Baku said, his voice deceptively soft. "Or a heavy secret. You work hard, but your mind is elsewhere. I see it." Ka's blood ran cold. "I am just tired, overseer." "We are all tired," Baku countered, stepping closer. "But we are not all cursed. Remember, the gods see everything. Even in the darkest places. They see the plans men make in the shadows of their hearts." The threat was unmistakable. Baku didn't know, not yet, but he suspected something. The overseer saw Ka as a loose stone in the foundation of his authority, a disruption he wanted gone. Ka mumbled a subordinate reply and hurried away, Baku's warning echoing in his ears. The net was tightening. He was running out of time. That night, Anapi had a violent coughing fit that brought up a fleck of blood on her lips. She looked at it, then at Ka, her eyes wide with a terror that shattered his last hesitation. The fear of the gods was immense. But the fear of losing her was greater. The scales in his own heart had tipped. The new moon provided the perfect shroud. The sky over the Theban necropolis was a black velvet cloth, sprinkled with the cold, distant light of the million-year stars. There was no sliver of light to betray a moving shadow, no divine eye of Horus to watch from the heavens. Ka moved through the darkness, a ghost in his own land. He wore a dark loincloth, his skin rubbed with mud and ash to dull its natural tone. In a leather satchel, he carried the tools of his sacrilege. A hardened copper chisel, a small pry bar, and a single, precious water skin. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence of the valley. Every crunch of his sandals on the gravel path sounded like a thunderclap. He imagined Medjay guards behind every boulder, the vengeful spirit of Nebuman watching from the cliff face. He was no thief. He was a builder. His hands knew the heft of stone, the grain of wood, the wet slap of plaster. They were not made for this skulking, this violation. But they were all he had. He reached the tomb of Nebuman, a simple, unadorned rectangle cut into the base of the cliff. The seal was intact, a smooth plaster face stamped with the Jackalan 9 captive seal of the necropolis priests. To an honest man, it was an inviolable barrier. To Ka, it was a puzzle. He set to work. He didn't smash it. That would be too loud. Instead, he used his chisel on the mortar around the edges of the blocking stones. He knew from experience that the masons, eager to finish a job, often used a weaker mix of plaster and sand behind the solid outer layer. Chip, scrape, pry. The sounds were terrifyingly loud in the stillness. He worked with a feverish intensity, sweat pouring down his face, stinging his good eye. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the flare of a torch, to hear the shouted challenge of a guard. But there was nothing. Only the immense, listening silence of the city of the dead. After what felt like an eternity, a large blocking stone loosened. He wedged his pry bar into the gap and leaned on it with all his weight. The stone scraped inward with a groan, opening a dark, narrow maw that smelled of stale air, dried natron, and something else, the scent of eternity. He slipped through the gap, his satchel scraping against the rock, and found himself in the first passage. The darkness inside was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in on him. It was a blackness untouched by sun or moon for all of time. He was blind. His good eye was as useless as his bad one. He had to rely on memory and touch. He stretched out his hands, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth plaster of the walls. He took a slow, shuffling step, then another, his mind rebuilding the tomb's layout from memory. 10 paces to the first sealed doorway. He reached it, his hands finding the wooden frame. This seal was also plaster. He set to work again, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thin, heavy. It felt like he was breathing in dust from the lungs of the dead. The teachings of the priests screamed in his mind. He was trespassing in the Duat, the underworld itself. He was disturbing the sacred sleep. Anubis, the opener of ways, would see him. Osiris, the great judge, would know his crime. He broke through the second seal and found himself in the rubble-filled corridor. This was the hardest part. He had to clear a path through the rocks and broken pottery that had been used to fill the space, a deterrent to thieves. Each stone he moved seemed to make a catastrophic noise. He worked methodically, creating a small tunnel through the debris, just large enough for his body to crawl through. Dust filled his nose and mouth. He took a desperate gulp from his water skin, the warm water a small comfort in the suffocating black. Finally, his hand touched another wooden surface. The door to the burial chamber itself. His heart seized with a fresh wave of terror. This was the final barrier. Beyond it lay the sarcophagus, the funerary goods, the spirit of Nebaman himself. He hesitated, his body trembling. He thought of Anapi, her small, frail form, the fleck of blood on her lips. His resolve hardened. He was not just a thief. He was a savior. He was doing this for her. With renewed determination, he worked at the final seal. It was stronger, made with more care. His muscles burned, his hands were raw. At last, he felt it give way. He pushed the small wooden door inward. It swung open with a faint, ghostly creak. He crawled into the burial chamber and stood up, his body screaming with exhaustion. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of cedar from the coffin, myrrh from the unguents, and the dry, papery smell of ancient linen. This was the hall of judgment in miniature. This was where his soul was being weighed. He couldn't see, but he knew where the offering tables were. He shuffled forward, his hands outstretched, a blind man in a treasure house. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. An alabaster jar. He felt its shape, its weight. It was small, easily concealable, but he knew the scented oil within it was worth a great deal to the living. This was it. This was Anapi's life in his hands. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. He had done it. A sound. A faint scrape from the passage behind him. Ka froze, his blood turning to ice. It wasn't the sound of settling rock. It was the sound of a sandal on stone. Then, a voice, dripping with triumphant malice, cut through the darkness. I knew the gods would show me the rat in this sacred house. I knew they would lead me to you, Ka. A torch flared to life, blinding him. In the sudden, dancing light, he saw the stout figure of Baku blocking the doorway, a heavy bronze-headed mace in his hand. His face was a mask of pure hatred. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. There was only the sputtering torch, the glint of malevolence in Baku's eyes, and the suffocating silence of the tomb. Ka's mind, which had been a whirlwind of fear and desperation, went utterly blank. He was caught. The word was a final, damning judgment. Caught in the sacred house of the dead, by the one man who wished him nothing but ruin. A thief, Baku hissed, taking a slow step into the chamber. The torchlight threw his shadow, huge and monstrous, against the painted figures on the wall. The gods of the underworld, Osiris, Thoth, Horus, seemed to turn their heads to watch. Worse than a thief. A parasite. A ghoul who feeds on the dead. And with your cursed eye, no less. You have brought your filth into this pure place. Ka's mind began to work again, racing through the impossible situation. There was no escape. The doorway was blocked. There were no other exits. He was trapped, cornered like a scorpion in a jar. Ka started, his voice cracking. What could he say? Plead for mercy. Baku knew no such thing. Explain about Anapi. Baku would laugh at his weakness. Silence. Baku spat. Do not defile this chamber with your lies. I watched you for weeks. I saw the way you looked at this tomb. I saw the greed in your good eye and the chaos in your bad one. He took another step, raising the mace slightly. The guards will be pleased. Impalement is too quick for your kind. Perhaps they will give you to the crocodiles. A fitting end for a creature of the mud. Ka's survival instinct, an ancient, primal thing, finally surged past his fear. He was not going to die here. He was not going to let Baku drag him out to a public, agonizing death while Anapi wasted away in their hut. If he was to be damned, he would be damned for a reason. He clutched the alabaster jar to his chest with one hand. With the other, he took a half step back, his heel bumping against the leg of a small offering table. His fingers brushed against something cool and heavy on its surface, a solid granite offering bowl. "This has nothing to do with you, Baku," Ka said, his voice low and steady now, filled with a coldness that surprised even himself. Baku laughed. A short, ugly bark. "It has everything to do with me. You are the bad luck I have been trying to scrape from my heel. You are the flaw in my work. When I deliver you to the Medjay, the vizier will hear of my diligence. My loyalty. He will see who the true, worthy servant is." Baku was grandstanding, savoring his moment of triumph. And in that moment, Ka saw his only chance. It was not a plan. It was an impulse. A desperate lunge against fate. With a guttural yell, Ka grabbed the granite bowl and hurled it with all his might, not at Baku, but at the torch in his hand. The heavy bowl struck Baku's arm with a sickening crunch of bone. The overseer roared in pain, the mace clattering to the floor. The torch flew from his grasp, arcing through the air like a dying star before landing on a pile of funerary linens in the corner. For a second, the linens smoldered. Then, with a sudden whoosh, they erupted in flame. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking at the dry wooden legs of a funerary couch, casting wild, dancing shadows across the chamber. Baku, clutching his broken arm, stared in horror at the growing inferno. "You fool! You will burn us both. You will destroy the soul of the dead." But Ka was already moving. The fire was his only ally. It was chaos. It was confusion. And it was light. In the flickering, hellish glare, he saw the path he needed. He dove past the screaming Baku, snatching the fallen mace from the floor as he went. Baku, maddened by pain and rage, lunged for him, trying to grab him with his good hand. Ka swung the heavy mace, not to kill, but to disable. The bronze head connected with Baku's knee. The overseer collapsed with a shriek. His body crashing against the wall, dislodging a painted plaster fragment that shattered on the floor. Smoke was filling the chamber now, thick and acrid. It burned Ka's lungs, made his good eye water. The heat was becoming unbearable. The painted faces of the gods seemed to melt and warp in the inferno. He had to get out. He scrambled back towards the doorway, the alabaster jar still pressed to his chest. The mace heavy in his hand. He glanced back one last time. Baku was on the floor, trying to crawl away from the flames, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. Their eyes met across the fiery chamber. In Baku's, Ka saw not just hatred, but a profound, soul-deep terror. He was going to die here, in the dark, in the fire, in a desecrated tomb. His spirit would be trapped, tormented. It was a fate worse than impalement. Ka felt a flicker of something, pity, revulsion, but he crushed it. He turned and plunged into the darkness of the passage, leaving the screams, the fire, and the judgment of the gods behind him. He crawled through the rubble-filled corridor, the smoke chasing him, the sounds of Baku's shrieks fading. He squeezed through the outer blocking stone and back into the cool night air of the valley. He stood there for a moment, gasping, his body trembling. Covered in soot and blood, his or Baku's, he didn't know. He looked back at the tomb. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible in the night, curled from the entrance before dissipating into the darkness. Silence returned to the valley. He was alive. He was free. And he was damned. The walk back to the village was a waking nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of a Medjay guard, every gust of wind carried the echo of Baku's dying screams. The adrenaline that had fueled him in the tomb drained away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. The alabaster jar in his satchel felt impossibly heavy, its weight not of stone, but of sin. The mace he still clutched in his hand was cold and slick. He let it fall into a deep crevice, its clatter swallowed by the darkness. He was a builder, not a killer. But what was the difference now? He had left a man to die in a burning grave. The gods would not distinguish between the intent and the act. He slipped back into the village, a shadow amongst shadows. He moved to the small, hidden cistern at the edge of the houses and washed the soot and blood from his skin in the cold, still water. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, but he could not wash away the feeling of filth. The scent of smoke clung to his hair and his clothes. He crept into his home. Anapi was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The sight of her, so fragile and so innocent, was a fresh torment. He had done this for her. He had desecrated the sacred, taken a life, and doomed his own soul for the chance that she might draw a few more breaths. He looked at his hands, the hands of a craftsman, and saw only the hands of a thief and a murderer. He hid the alabaster jar under a loose floor stone, wrapping it in a spare piece of linen. He lay on his mat, but sleep was a foreign country he could not enter. He stared into the darkness, and the darkness stared back. He saw the fire. He heard the screams. He felt the weight of the granite bowl, the sickening crunch of bone. He had not just robbed a tomb, he had become a tomb, a sealed chamber holding a dead man and a terrible secret. At the first hint of dawn, before the work horn sounded, Ka took the jar and slipped out of the village. He made his way to the riverbank where the traders and merchants set up their stalls to catch the early traffic from the ferry. He found the man he was looking for, a Syrian merchant with eyes like polished obsidian, a man known to ask no questions as long as the goods were valuable. Ka unwrapped the jar. Even in the grey morning light, the alabaster glowed with a soft, milky luminescence. It was flawlessly carved, its lid sealed with a small plug of beeswax. The merchant's eyes widened, a flicker of professional greed crossing his features. He took the jar, his fingers caressing its smooth surface. He examined the seal, sniffed at it. A fine piece, the merchant said, his voice a low rumble. From a family inheritance, no doubt. The sarcasm was gentle. A professional courtesy. I need an ivory amulet of Bess. The kind from the main temple at Karnak. Blessed, Ka said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The merchant raised an eyebrow. A powerful charm. For protection. For a child. He was probing, but Ka did not flinch. The price? Ka asked. The merchant weighed the jar in his hands. This unguent is rare. Fit for a queen. An amulet of that quality, it is a steep trade. He paused. His eyes appraising Ka, seeing the desperation behind the stony facade. But I am a man who appreciates fine things. And I happen to have just such a charm. He produced a small leather pouch. From it, he tipped a small, intricately carved piece of ivory. It was the god Bes, the dwarf deity, with his wild mane and his tongue sticking out, brandishing a protective knife. It was a masterpiece of the carver's art. This will guard against any demon, any sickness of the spirit, the merchant murmured. It is yours. For the jar. The trade was made. Ka's priceless, stolen treasure for a piece of carved ivory. He took the amulet, its surface smooth and cool against his palm. He turned and walked away without another word, the merchant's knowing gaze following him. He ran back to the village, the amulet clutched in his fist. He found Anapi awake. Her face pale, her breathing a painful, shallow rhythm. Ka, she whispered as he knelt beside her. He said nothing. He gently untied the simple string of beads around her neck and replaced it with a new leather cord holding the amulet of Bes. The ivory lay stark and white against her feverish skin. What is it? She asked, her fingers weakly touching the charm. Protection, he said, his voice thick. The healer was right. You need protection. She looked at the amulet, then up at him. She was weak, but her eyes were clear. And in them, he saw not just gratitude, but a question. Where did this come from? How could you afford such a thing? He could not meet her gaze. He stood up, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Rest now, little bird. Let the god do his work. He turned and left the hut. stepping out into the morning sun, which felt, for the first time, like an accusation. The work horn sounded from the valley. A new day of labor was beginning. He had to go back. Back to the tombs. Back to the place of his crime, and act as if nothing had happened. He had to pretend he was still Ka, the laborer, the man with the unlucky eye. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now. The trembling had stopped. He had done the unthinkable. He had traded his soul for her breath. And as he walked towards the valley, he wondered if the gods, in their infinite, terrifying wisdom, would consider it a fair trade. The days that followed were a new kind of torment, a silent, internal version of the impalement he had escaped. Outwardly, nothing changed. Ka went to work. He swung his mallet, he hauled his stones, he ate his gritty bread. But inside, he was a hollow man, listening. He listened for the shouted discovery from Nebamon's tomb. He listened for the whispers among the Medjay guards. He listened for his own name to be spoken in accusation. But there was only the familiar, rhythmic sound of work, the endless chipping of stone that defined their lives. Baku was gone. His absence was a gaping hole in the daily routine. The first day. The other workers muttered among themselves. Had he been summoned by the vizier? Was he drunk on beer in some hidden corner of the village? By the third day, a new overseer had been appointed, a grim, efficient man who cared only for the daily quota of rock cleared. Baku's disappearance was noted, officially reported, and then, like a stone dropped into the Nile, simply vanished from conversation. Men disappeared sometimes. The desert was vast, the work was dangerous. Scorpions, snakes, a fall from a scaffold. Life was cheap. No one mourned Baku. Ka, most of all, feigned ignorance, his face a mask of weary indifference. But every time he entered the cool darkness of a tomb, he could smell the faint, phantom scent of smoke and burning flesh. He spent his energy on Anapi. He returned home each night not with dread, but with a fragile, painful hope. He would find her sitting up, the ivory amulet of Bes clutched in her hand. The honey andate paste he bought with his meager wages seemed to soothe her throat, and slowly, miraculously, the fever began to recede. The rattling in her chest lessened, replaced by a clearer, if still shallow, breath. Color returned to her cheeks. One evening, he came home to find her standing, humming a small, reedy tune as she stirred a pot of lentil soup. She turned and gave him a genuine smile, the first he had seen in months. "The god is strong, Ka," she said, her voice clearer than it had been in a year. "He is chasing the demon away." Ka could only nod, his throat tight. He looked at the amulet resting against her collarbone. A piece of stolen ivory. A life for a life. He had made a bargain with the darkness. And the darkness, it seemed, had kept its end of the deal. But the price was steep. He found he could no longer bear to look at the tomb paintings. The serene faces of the gods seemed to mock him. The scene of the weighing of the heart was a direct, personal accusation. His heart was not light as a feather. It was a block of granite, heavier than any stone he had ever hauled, weighed down by the body of Baku and the ghost of a desecrated tomb. He began to have nightmares. Not of fire or guards, but of suffocating darkness. He would dream he was back in Nebamon's chamber, but it was he who was trapped, his mouth open in a silent scream, his limbs frozen, while the spirit of the dead scribe stood over him, its face a blank mask of eternal judgment. He would wake up gasping, his own hut feeling as close and confining as a sarcophagus. His cynicism, once a protective shield, had curdled into a genuine, gnawing fear. He had defied the gods to save his sister, but now he found himself trying to appease them in small, secret ways. He would leave a portion of his bread at a small, wayside shrine to Taurit, the protector of children. He would murmur a prayer to Anubis before entering the tombs each morning, asking the god of embalmers to forgive his trespass. These were the acts of a man he had once scorned. A man terrified of what awaited him on the other side. Anapi, in her innocence, saw only a change for the better. Your spirit is lighter, Ka, she told him one night as they shared their soup. You are not so angry at the world. He looked at her healthy glow, at the life he had bought for her. He was not lighter. He was heavier than ever before. But the weight was his alone to carry. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps I am just tired of being angry. The tomb of the Vizier Pasir was nearing completion. The final passages were being smoothed, the last of the hieroglyphs painted in vibrant color. Soon, the burial would take place, and the tomb would be sealed. They would move on to the next one, a new house of eternity for another rich man. The cycle was endless. One day, while clearing the final debris from the entrance passage, Ka's chisel struck something that wasn't rock. It was a patch of newer plaster, clumsily applied. He stared at it, his heart beginning to pound. It was a recent repair, covering a crack in the wall. Behind it, he knew, was the antechamber of a much older, forgotten tomb from a previous dynasty, one that had been accidentally breached and then quickly sealed up by the builders to avoid delays and the vizier's wrath. It was a common practice. His fellow workers saw it too. One of them, a man named Ipu, glanced around nervously. Say nothing, Ipu whispered, his eyes wide. The overseer will have us flogged for this delay. They worked quickly to cover the spot, to erase the discovery. But Ka saw it for what it was. A secret. A weakness in the sacred design. A door where there should be none. He saw another tomb, filled with the treasures of a forgotten age, unguarded, unknown. He thought of the risk, the terror, the fight in the dark. He thought of Baku's body, sealed away in eternal silence. He thought of his own damned soul. He should have been horrified. He should have turned away and forgotten what he saw. But then he looked at his hands, calloused and strong. He thought of Anapi's smile. He thought of the 5 deben of silver. A sum that could buy not just one amulet, but a small house, a donkey, a life free from the dust and the whims of men like Baku. A life of peace. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But it was familiar now. It was the price. He had paid it once. The chilling realization that settled over him was not that he could do it again. It was that he would. He had stared into the abyss. And the abyss had shown him a way out. His heart was already heavier than a stone. What was one more pebble on the scale? He finished his work for the day, his mind quiet and clear for the first time in months. As he walked out of the tomb and into the unforgiving light of the Egyptian sun, he did not feel like a man who was damned. He felt like a man who finally understood the true nature of the gods, of men, and of survival. And in that brutal, terrifying clarity, he felt something that tasted almost like freedom. The peace, if such a thing could be named, was a fragile veneer over a chasm of anxiety. Ka went about his days with a new, chilling purpose. He was no longer just a laborer. He was a keeper of secrets, a student of shadows. The forgotten tomb behind the plaster wall became the focal point of his existence. An obsession that overshadowed even the constant, low-grade fear of Baku's discovery. He learned to be invisible. He lingered after the work horn sounded, citing the need to tidy a section or sharpen a tool, using the precious moments of twilight to study the sealed-off breach. He measured it with his own hands, tested the surrounding rock for weaknesses. He became a master of his own small world, noting the shift changes of the Medjay. The paths they walked, the moments their attention was diverted by a shared joke or a wineskin. Anapi continued to flourish. The amulet of Bess never left her neck, a stark white talisman against her darkening skin as she spent more time in the sun. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, became a common music in their small home. She did not understand the source of the shadow in Ka's eyes, but she saw that he was more attentive. That the sharp edges of his anger had been worn smooth, replaced by a deep, unsettling calm. She mistook his watchfulness for peace. One evening, she sat weaving a small basket from river reeds, her fingers nimble and sure. "You should find a wife, Ka," she said, her voice casual, but her eyes were keen. "I am strong now. You do not need to spend all your wages on me. Ipu's daughter, Merit, she looks at you when you pass." Ka stopped cleaning the day's dust from his tools. A wife. A family. The thought was so alien, so distant from the dark path he was walking, that it felt like a story from another man's life. A life where hearts were light, where tombs were only for the dead, where survival did not demand a pact with darkness. "Merit deserves a man with 2 good eyes and a soul that is not mortgaged," he said, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "Your soul is good," Anapi insisted, pausing her weaving. "You are the best of men, my brother." Her innocence was a physical blow. He turned away, unable to bear the purity of her belief in him. He was the best of men, and he had left a man to die in a fire-filled tomb. He was the best of men, and he was methodically planning to do something far worse. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. The Vizier Pasayr died. The news swept through Deir el-Medina like a wind off the desert, bringing with it a strange mix of somber ritualism and frenetic energy. The 70-day period of mourning and embalming had ended. The funeral procession was being prepared. For the village, it meant the culmination of years of work, followed by a generous bonus of grain, beer, and linen from the pharaoh's storehouses. It meant a week of feasting and rest before the next project began. For Ka, it meant chaos. The entire focus of the necropolis guards, the priests, and the officials would be on the grand ceremony for Pasayr. The procession would be a magnificent spectacle, winding its way from the river, across the plain, and up into the valley. The attention of every living soul would be fixed on the golden sarcophagus of the vizier. The older, less important parts of the necropolis would be all but deserted. It was the perfect moment, a window of divine distraction. He finalized his plan. This time, it would be different. He was not a desperate amateur. He was a professional. He prepared meticulously. He stole small amounts of oil from the workshop stores, enough to fill a larger lamp that would burn for hours. He fashioned a new, stronger pry bar, hiding it in the thatch of his roof. He saved his food rations, creating a small stockpile. This would not be a single grab. The forgotten tomb was likely large, undisturbed for centuries. It required methodical exploration. The night before the funeral, he told Anapi he would be taking a special night shift, guarding the tools at the new tomb site, an honor given to trustworthy workers. It was a lie, but one she accepted without question. She prepared a small pouch of dates and roasted barley for him. "Be safe," she said, touching the amulet at her neck, a gesture that had become second nature. "May Bess watch over you. And you, little bird," he whispered, his heart a cold, heavy thing. The hypocrisy was a poison in his throat. As the village slept, Ka slipped out, not towards the new site, but back towards the tomb of Pasayr. He moved with a practiced silence, the tools of his trade wrapped in linen to prevent them from clinking. The necropolis was eerily quiet, bathed in the ethereal light of a full moon. In the distance, he could see the funeral barges on the Nile, their lamps like a string of captured stars. He reached Pasayr's tomb. The Great Seal was already in place, a massive stone and plaster barrier that would not be breached until the procession arrived at dawn. He ignored it, slipping around to the side passage where he had discovered the flaw. Working in the pale moonlight, he began to chip away the plaster. It felt different this time. The terror was still there, a cold snake coiled in his belly, but it was overlaid with a grim, focused determination. He was no longer a man driven by a single, noble impulse. He was a man making a calculated choice. This was not for Anapi's life. This was for his own. He broke through into the darkness. He paused, listening. Silence. He lit his lamp, the flame chasing away the shadows, revealing a short, rough-hewn tunnel. It led to another, far older seal. This one was brittle with age, the plaster crumbling at his touch. It bore the cartouche of a king he barely recognized from the temple lists, a ruler from a dynasty long swallowed by time. He pushed, and the seal disintegrated into a cascade of dust and stone, revealing a doorway. He raised his lamp and peered inside. The air that washed over him was impossibly ancient. Dry as bone, and thick with the scent of long-vanished perfumes and the silent, patient dust of millennia. He was the first living thing to breathe this air in over 400 years. He stepped inside, and the lamplight fell upon a scene of unimaginable splendor. It was not a simple burial chamber. It was a suite of rooms, a house of eternity built for a queen, judging by the iconography on the walls. The antechamber was filled with gilded chests, their surfaces inlaid with ivory and ebony. Ornate chairs with legs carved into the shape of lions stood as if their owner had just risen from them. Alabaster vessels of every size and shape lined the walls, their contents long evaporated but their beauty undiminished. Ka stood frozen, the lamp trembling in his hand. The sheer scale of the wealth was staggering, beyond anything he had ever imagined. The tomb of Nebaman had been a paltry storeroom compared to this. This was a treasure house of the gods. His mind, accustomed to calculating value in terms of bread and beer, could not process what he was seeing. This was not a resource to be plundered for a single amulet, this was a fortune that could remake a dozen lives. Avarice, cold and sharp, pierced through his awe. This was it. The answer to a life of toil. The end of the dust. He moved deeper into the chamber, his sandals crunching on fallen bits of plaster. He ran a hand over a golden chest, the metal cool and smooth beneath his calloused fingers. He lifted the lid. Inside, folded with meticulous care, were bolts of the finest royal linen, so sheer they were almost transparent. Beside them, nestled in soft wrappings, were golden sandals, a necklace of lapis lazuli beads the color of the midnight sky, and a diadem of beaten gold. He was in a dream. But the weight of the gold was real. The cool of the lapis was real. He moved into the next room, the burial chamber itself. A large stone sarcophagus dominated the space, its lid firmly in place. But it was the items around it that held his attention. Canopic jars with heads of gods, their painted eyes seeming to follow him. A fleet of miniature wooden boats, complete with tiny oarsmen, ready to carry the queen's soul across the waters of the underworld. And on a small table near the sarcophagus, an object that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a funerary mask. Not of solid gold like a pharaoh's, but of gilded cartonnage, its features serene and beautiful, its eyes inlaid with obsidian and calcite, giving them a startlingly lifelike gaze. The mask stared at him, a silent, eternal witness to his intrusion. He reached out a trembling hand to touch it, then recoiled. This was too sacred. To touch the face of the dead, that was a line he had not yet crossed. He spent hours in the tomb, a man possessed. He worked with a feverish energy, sorting, evaluating, planning. He could not carry it all. He had to be strategic. He chose smaller, high-value objects, the lapis necklace, a handful of golden rings from a jewelry box, a small, solid gold statuette of the goddess Isis. He wrapped them carefully in a square of the ancient linen and placed them in his leather satchel. The lamp began to flicker, the oil running low. It was a warning. Time was running out. The first light of dawn would soon be breaking, and the funeral procession of the Vizier Pasir would begin its slow march into the valley. He had to be gone before then. He took one last look around the treasure-filled chamber. He had barely scratched the surface. He could come back. Again and again. The thought was intoxicating. He could drain this tomb, piece by piece, and build a new life for himself and Anapi, a life of unimaginable comfort. As he turned to leave, the lamplight caught something on the wall he hadn't noticed before. It was a painting, partially obscured by a fallen piece of plaster. It depicted the final judgment. But this one was different. It showed a man whose heart was being weighed and found heavy. It showed the great devourer, Ammit, lunging forward, her crocodile jaws open wide. And the face of the damned man, it was indistinct, blurred by time, but in the flickering, dying light of his lamp, Ka could have sworn it had one clouded, milky eye. A wave of absolute terror washed over him, so powerful it buckled his knees. He stumbled back, dropping his lamp. It hit the stone floor and extinguished, plunging him into absolute, suffocating darkness. He was alone in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, the image of the painting burned into his mind. It was a sign. A warning from the gods he had sought to cheat. They had shown him his own face. His own fate. Panic seized him. He scrambled for the doorway, his hands scrabbling against the cool stone. He found the opening and flung himself through it, back into the rough-hewn tunnel. He didn't stop until he had resealed the entrance, working with frantic, clumsy hands, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He plastered over the opening, smearing it with dust and debris to hide his work. He fled the tomb of Passer, the satchel of treasure banging against his back. He did not stop running until he reached the cliffs high above the village. He crouched behind a boulder, his body shaking uncontrollably, and waited for the dawn. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in hues of saffron and rose. From his vantage point, Ka watched the great funeral procession of the vizier begin. He saw the priests in their leopard skins. The weeping mourners, the slow, majestic progress of the golden shrine containing the sarcophagus. He watched the world of order, of ritual, of Ma'at, unfold below him. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he no longer belonged to it. He was a ghost, a creature of the shadows, haunted by the treasures he had stolen and the gods he could not escape. The treasure in his bag was not a promise of a new life. It was the price of his soul. Ka did not return to the village immediately. He remained hidden in the hills all day, a fugitive in his own land, while the grand funeral of the vizier Passer filled the valley below. The sounds of chanting and ceremonial horns drifted up to him on the hot wind, a constant reminder of the sacred world he had violated. The satchel of treasure lay beside him, a cold, heavy lump of gold and sin. The initial wave of terror had subsided, replaced by a dull, aching dread. The painting on the tomb wall was not a memory, it was a prophecy. When night fell again, he crept back to Deir el-Medina. He hid the satchel in a deep, secret crevice in the rocks far from his home, a place no one would ever think to look. He could not bring it into the house. He could not let its cursed aura touch Anapi. She was waiting for him. Her face etched with worry. Ka. I was so afraid. The overseer said you never arrived for the tool watch. He had forgotten his lie. His mind, consumed by the tomb, had erased everything else. I was moved to a different post. Guarding the outer valley pass. The message did not reach him. It was a weak excuse, but she was too relieved to question it. She threw her arms around him, and for the first time, he flinched at her touch, feeling unworthy of her embrace. Life returned to its rhythm, but for Ka, the music was gone. There was only a dissonant, jarring silence. The week of feasting and rest was a torment. The other villagers celebrated, drinking the pharaoh's beer and eating the bonus rations of meat. Ka could taste nothing. The laughter and music of the festival felt like a funeral dirge. He watched the other men. Their faces flushed with simple joy, and felt a chasm open between them and himself. They were celebrating the completion of their work. He was hiding the evidence of his crime. He began to change. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. The cynical humor that had once been his shield was gone, replaced by a haunted, watchful silence. He took to spending his evenings alone, walking the perimeter of the village wall. His gaze fixed on the necropolis, a silent sentinel guarding his own terrible secret. Anapi noticed the change. "What troubles you, brother?" she asked him one night, her hand resting on his arm. "The work is done. We have food. I am well. Why does your spirit seem to walk in the land of the dead?" "I am just tired," he would say, the same hollow excuse. How could he tell her that her health was bought with his soul? How could he explain that he had looked upon the face of his own damnation? He could not bring himself to touch the stolen treasure. The thought of spending it, of trading it for worldly goods, filled him with a paralyzing fear. It was as if the gold itself was cursed, that to use it would be to alert the gods, to bring their wrath down upon him and Anape. The treasure that was meant to be his salvation became his heaviest burden. Weeks turned into a month. A new project was announced, a small but richly appointed tomb for one of the pharaoh's favorite military generals. Work began anew. Ka went through the motions, his body performing the familiar tasks, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the dusty darkness of the forgotten queen's tomb. The nightmares grew worse. He saw Baku's face, contorted in the flames. He saw the queen's serene mask, its eyes seeming to weep black tears. And always, he saw the painting of the damned man with one white eye. He started waking with a scream caught in his throat, his body drenched in cold sweat. His health began to suffer. He lost his appetite. A gaunt, haunted look entered his good eye. The other workers started whispering again. Ka, the man marked by Set, was now being consumed by a wasting sickness of the spirit. They avoided him more than ever. One afternoon, a rock slide occurred in the new tomb, a common enough event. A large block of limestone dislodged and crashed down, crushing the leg of a young worker. The man's screams echoed through the passages. As the others rushed to help, Ka found himself frozen, his body refusing to move. He stared at the injured man, at the blood pooling in the dust, and all he could see was Baku, lying broken on the floor of the tomb. He fled. He scrambled out of the tomb and into the blinding sun, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't live in this world of stone and death, a living ghost haunted by the dead. He went to the crevice and retrieved the satchel. The gold inside felt cold as a corpse. He knew what he had to do. It was an insane, desperate idea, a plan born not of greed, but of a profound need for atonement. He could not unkill Baku. He could not unsee the painting. But he could, perhaps, return the offering. He could try to appease the spirit he had wronged. He would not sell the treasure. He would take it back. The plan was madness. To enter the tomb again was to risk everything. But living with the secret was a slower, more agonizing death. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has accepted his fate. He would return the gold to the queen. And he would seal the tomb forever, sealing his secret, and perhaps his damnation, with it. He would walk away with nothing but his own soul, however tarnished it may be. It was the only price he could still afford to pay. He waited for the next new moon, the night of deepest darkness. He prepared his tools once more, but this time, they did not feel like the tools of a thief. They felt like the tools of a penitent. He was not going to rob a tomb. He was going to perform a burial. His own. The second journey into the Valley of the Dead was different from the first. The frantic, heart-pounding terror was gone, replaced by a cold, solemn resolve. Ka moved with the quiet dignity of a priest approaching a sacred rite. The satchel on his back no longer felt like a burden of sin, but like a necessary offering, the only one he could make. He reached the tomb of Paseir and, with practiced ease, opened the hidden breach into the forgotten queen's resting place. The air that greeted him was the same, ancient, dry, and silent. He lit his lamp, its steady flame a small beacon of purpose in the immense darkness. He stepped inside. The antechamber was just as he had left it, a tableau of frozen, opulent time. The gilded chests, the lion-legged chairs, the silent alabaster jars. But this time, he saw them not with the eyes of a thief, but with the eyes of a penitent. This was a home. A sacred space he had violated. He walked into the burial chamber. The funerary mask with its serene, lifelike eyes seemed to be waiting for him. He approached the offering table and gently, reverently, unwrapped the objects from his satchel. The lapis necklace coiled on the stone surface, a pool of midnight blue. The golden rings gleamed in the lamplight. The statuette of Isis seemed to raise its arms in a gesture of acceptance. He placed each item back exactly where he had found it. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so powerful it was almost dizzying. The weight on his soul seemed to lift, if only by a fraction. He had not undone his crime, but he had made restitution. He had returned what was stolen. He turned to leave, his task complete. And then he saw it. On the floor, near the entrance to the burial chamber, was something he hadn't noticed before, something that had been kicked into the shadows during his frantic escape. It was a leather satchel. Not his. It was a finer piece of work, with a bronze buckle. Baku's satchel. Ka stared at it, his blood running cold. Why would Baku have brought a satchel into the tomb? Had he been following him, planning to steal the treasure for himself after Ka had done the hard work? The thought was a venomous dart. Driven by a grim curiosity, he nudged the satchel with his foot. It was heavy. He knelt and unfastened the buckle. He tipped the contents onto the floor. It was not gold or treasure that spilled out. It was bread. A water skin. A small bundle of dried dates. And a small, crudely carved wooden bird, the kind a father might make for his child. Ka stared at the simple provisions, his mind reeling. This was not the satchel of a rival thief. This was the satchel of a man who was running away. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Baku hadn't followed him into the tomb out of suspicion. Baku had been using the distraction of the funeral to flee Deir el-Medina. He had likely been caught skimming from the royal storehouses, or had made a powerful enemy, or was simply escaping the crushing life of an overseer. The forgotten tomb was his hiding place, a temporary refuge until he could escape into the desert. Ka had not stumbled upon a rival. He had stumbled upon another desperate man. A man whose escape route he had unknowingly blocked. And the fight. Baku had not been attacking him to protect the tomb. He had been fighting for his life, a cornered man trying to defend his only sanctuary from an intruder. Ka fell back, his hand flying to his mouth, a wave of nausea sweeping over him. He had not killed a villain. He had killed a man as trapped as he was. A man whose story he had never known. He had judged Baku as a monster, a simple, cruel overseer. But here, in the dust of the tomb, was the evidence of a more complex truth. A man who carried a child's toy. The weight that had lifted from his soul crashed back down, 10 times heavier. His act of restitution was a hollow gesture. He hadn't just desecrated a tomb and stolen from the dead. He had murdered a fugitive. His crime was not just against the gods. It was against a man. He looked around the chamber, at the gilded furniture and the serene face of the dead queen. This place was no longer a sacred house or a treasure store. It was a grave. His grave and Baku's. They were both trapped here now, bound by a secret that could never be spoken. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to confess, to scream his crime to the heavens. But who would listen? Who would understand? He would be executed as a common tomb robber. The nuances of his story, Anapi's illness, Baku's desperate flight, would be lost, dismissed as the lies of a guilty man. He knew then that there was no atonement. There was no escape. His fate was sealed not by the gods, but by his own actions. With a heart made of lead, he stood up. He left Baku's meager possessions on the floor. He walked out of the burial chamber and began the solemn, final task of sealing the tomb. He worked with the precision of a master craftsman, fitting the stones, plastering the seals. Each movement was a prayer. Each stone was an apology. He was not just sealing a tomb to hide a secret. He was performing a burial rite for the man he had killed and the man he had become. When he was finished, the wall was smooth, flawless. No one would ever know of the door behind it. No one would ever know of the queen, the treasure, or the two souls, one dead, one living, trapped within. He walked out of Paseir's tomb for the last time and did not look back. He left his tools, his trade, his old life, behind him. He walked past his village, past the sleeping form of his sister who owed her life to his sin. He walked out into the great, star-dusted silence of the desert, a man with no name, no trade, and no soul to weigh. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he was walking towards a horizon that promised nothing but the chance to put one foot in front of the other, a penance that would last for the rest of his days. The desert accepted him without judgment. It was a vast, indifferent canvas of sand and stone, a place that cared little for the sins of men. For Ka, its emptiness was a balm. The silence of the dunes was a relief after the imagined whispers of the tombs. Here, there were no accusing eyes of gods on temple walls, no suspicious glances from fellow villagers. There was only the sun, the wind, and the stark, brutal honesty of survival. He walked east, towards the distant line of the Red Sea hills. He had no plan, no destination. He lived as the desert creatures lived. He learned to find water in the shade of a rock, to read the tracks of a jerboa, to eat the bitter leaves of the acacia. The satchel that had once held treasure now held only a water skin and a handful of dried dates he had taken from his home before he left. When they were gone, he did not panic. Hunger was an old, familiar companion. The skills of a tomb builder were useless here. But the resilience of a man who had spent his life in punishing labor was not. His body, hardened by years of hauling stone, was strong. His mind, sharpened by years of navigating the complex social world of Deir el-Medina, was keen. He learned to see the desert not as an enemy, but as a harsh and unforgiving teacher. Days blurred into weeks. The sun baked his skin to the color of dark leather. His hair and beard grew wild, matted with sand. The milky film over his left eye seemed less a curse and more a part of the landscape, like a patch of sun-bleached rock. He was shedding the identity of Ka, the tomb builder. He was becoming something else, something elemental. He thought of Anapi constantly. The memory of her smile was both a comfort and a torment. Had he done the right thing? He had saved her life, but he had abandoned her. He had given her a future but removed himself from it. He prayed, in his own silent, godless way, that she would be safe, that the community, in its grudging way, would look after the orphan sister of a man who had simply vanished. He hoped she believed his lie, that he had been sent to a distant quarry, a story that would protect her from the shame of his desertion. One evening, as he huddled for warmth behind a rock formation, he saw the lights of a small caravan in the distance. It was a mining expedition, likely heading for the turquoise mines in the Sinai. He watched them for a long time, the flicker of their campfire a small, fragile spark of humanity in the immense darkness. For a moment, he was tempted to approach them, to trade his story for a piece of bread, to rejoin the world of men. But he resisted. What would he say? Who was he? He was a ghost. A man who carried a tomb inside him. As he was about to turn away, one of the caravan men began to sing. It was a simple worker's song, a lament about the hardness of the work and the softness of a lover's embrace. The melody, rough and heartfelt, drifted across the desert, and it broke something open in Ka. Tears streamed down his face, the first he had shed since he was a boy. They were not tears of self-pity or fear. They were tears of profound, bottomless grief. He wept for Baku, the desperate man he had killed. He wept for the queen, whose eternal rest he had violated. He wept for the boy he had been, the one who dreamed of making stone birds fly. And most of all, he wept for Anapi, for the simple, shared life he had sacrificed. The weeping exhausted him. When it was over, he felt empty. The ghosts that had haunted him had not been vanquished, but they had been acknowledged. He rose, his limbs stiff, and looked towards the dying embers of the distant campfire. He could not go back, but he could not stay here either. To wander the desert alone was a slow suicide, an abdication. Anapi's life, bought at such a terrible price, demanded that he live. It would be a betrayal of his sacrifice to simply waste away and be covered by the shifting sands. He began to walk towards the caravan. He approached the camp at dawn. A ragged, solitary figure emerging from the twilight. The guards, seeing him from a distance, raised their spears, their shouted challenges sharp in the crisp morning air. Ka stopped and raised his empty hands, a universal gesture of peace. The caravan master, a burly, bearded man with the hard eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime bargaining with the desert, came forward to meet him. "Who are you?" the master asked, his hand resting on the pommel of a bronze dagger at his belt. "A bandit? A runaway?" Ka looked at the man. His face was a mask of dust and grief. "I am a man who is lost," he said, his voice a dry croak. "I have no name left to give. I ask only for work. My back is strong. I can haul stone and carry water. I ask for nothing but a share of the bread and a place to walk." The caravan master studied him. He looked at Ka's calloused hands, the corded muscles in his arms, the grim endurance in his one good eye. He saw not a threat, but a tool. A strong back was always useful. "A man with no name is a man with a secret," the master said, his tone pragmatic. "Secrets are heavy baggage on a long journey. But the desert does not care for names. It only cares if you can keep pace." He gestured to a pile of supply sacks. "You can load the donkeys. We move at sunrise. We will call you Ash, for that is what you look like you've been sleeping in." And so, Ka died, and Ash was born. The work was brutal, but it was a different kind of brutality. It was the simple, honest hardship of moving heavy things under a hot sun. It was work for the living, for the turquoise and copper that would be fashioned into jewelry and tools. Not for the silent, demanding dead. There were no hieroglyphs to remind him of judgment, no sacred spaces to defile. There was only the creak of the donkey carts, the grunts of the men, and the endless, shifting horizon. Ash, as he was now called, spoke little. He did his work, took his ration, and sat alone by the fire at night, staring into the flames. The other men, miners, guards, drovers, were a rough, boisterous lot. They gambled with knucklebones, told crude jokes, and sang songs of home. They mostly left him alone, accepting him as a strange, silent man touched by the desert's madness. He listened to their stories. Stories of families in the Delta, of debts owed in Memphis, of dreams of finding a single, large turquoise stone that would buy their freedom. They were simple stories, human stories. And they slowly, painfully, began to stitch him back into the fabric of the world. He was an observer, a ghost at their fire, but he was present. He still dreamed of the tomb. He would wake in a cold sweat, the image of Baku's terrified face burned into his mind. The guilt had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer a frantic, screaming terror, but a permanent, quiet ache in the center of his chest. A part of him now, like his sightless eye. One day, the caravan master sat beside him as he was mending a broken strap on a water skin. "You have the hands of a craftsman," the older man observed, watching Ash's nimble fingers. "Not a common laborer." Ash did not look up. "My hands do what is asked of them. Every man in this caravan is running from something," the master continued, his voice low. "A wife. A debt, a blood feud. The Sinai is a good place to disappear. The Pharaoh's reach is long, but the desert is longer. Whatever you are running from, I hope you find your peace at the end of it. But know this, Ash, no matter how far you walk, you can never run away from yourself." Ash pulled the leather strap tight, his knuckles white. He said nothing. The master grunted, stood up, and walked away, leaving him alone with the truth of his words. The caravan pressed on. They entered the jagged, mountainous landscape of the Sinai, a world of red rock and profound silence. They were getting closer to the mines. Closer to a new life, a new kind of prison. Ash looked back the way he had come, across the vast, empty expanse. Thebes was a world away. Anapi was a lifetime away. He was a ghost, walking towards a place where he could be buried alive, not in a tomb, but in the anonymity of hard labor. It was not peace. It was not atonement. But perhaps, for a man with a heart heavier than stone, it was the only kind of existence left. The turquoise mines of Sarabit el-Khatham were awound in the earth. It was not a single pit, but a sprawling network of shafts and galleries driven deep into the sandstone cliffs, a chaotic testament to centuries of human toil. The air was thick with the same fine, lung-clogging dust Ka had known his whole life, but here it was tinged red from the iron oxides in the rock. The workers were a motley collection of convicts, prisoners of war, and desperate men like himself who had traded their freedom for a daily ration of bread and water. Ash was assigned to a gang working a new gallery. The work was familiar and punishing, chipping at the rock face with bronze chisels, hauling baskets of stone out into the blinding sun. The overseers here were not cunning schemers like Baku, they were brutal soldiers, quick with a whip and indifferent to the lives of the men under their command. Death was a casual affair, a collapsed tunnel, a misplaced step on a high ledge, a fever that burned through the camp. No one mourned. A body was simply dragged away, and a new worker took its place. In this purgatory of labor, Ash found a strange kind of solace. The sheer physical exhaustion of the work left no room for thought. His days were a blur of muscle-straining effort, his nights a black, dreamless sleep. The ghosts of his past were still there, but their voices were drowned out by the constant ringing of chisels on rock. He was no longer Ka, the tormented soul. He was Ash, the laborer, a body reduced to its most basic functions. Work, eat, sleep. He kept to himself, a silent, efficient worker. His one eye made him an object of curiosity, but his quiet intensity and obvious strength discouraged trouble. He shared his bread with a young Nubian boy whose leg had been injured, an act of silent compassion that earned him a nod of respect from some of the other lifers. He was slowly, unconsciously, carving out a new, minimal existence. One day, while working deep in a narrow shaft, his chisel struck a pocket of soft sandstone. It crumbled away, revealing a small, dark cavity. It was not a sign of turquoise. It was something else. His heart, which he thought had turned to stone, began to beat faster. He glanced around. The overseer was at the far end of the gallery. The other workers were focused on their own sections of the rock face. Carefully, he chipped away at the edges of the cavity. It widened into a small opening, just large enough for him to peer into. He held his small clay lamp to the hole. The light revealed a space no larger than a small chest. It was a simple, ancient burial, likely of a long-forgotten foreman or minor official from a much older expedition, sealed away by a long-ago rockfall. And inside, resting on the dusty floor of the cavity, was a single, small, funerary chest. The sight sent a jolt of ice through his veins. A tomb. Even here, in this remote wasteland, the dead pursued him. He felt the old terror rise, the suffocating feeling of being trapped. He should have sealed the hole immediately, pretended he had seen nothing. But he hesitated. He thought of the contents. Not for their value, gold meant nothing to him now, but as a sign. Was this a test from the gods? A temptation to see if he would sin again? Or was it something else? Over the next few days, he worked his way closer to the hidden burial, his mind a battlefield. The memory of the queen's tomb, of the treasure that had brought him nothing but misery, was a powerful deterrent. But a grim curiosity gnawed at him. Who was this man, buried and forgotten so far from the sacred soil of the Nile? Finally, he could resist no longer. During a shift change, when the gallery was empty for a few precious moments, he broke through the final layer of rock and reached into the cavity. The wooden chest was light, its hinges long corroded. He pulled it out and forced the lid open. There was no gold, no jewels. Inside lay only a papyrus scroll, tied with a brittle linen string, and a single, polished river stone. Smooth and gray. His hands trembled as he untied the string and carefully unrolled the scroll. It was a simple funerary text, written in a hurried, non-scribal hand. It was not from the Book of the Dead. It was a letter. A letter from a son to his father. To my father, Anen, it read. Asterisk, they bury you here, far from the waters of our home. I have no priest to speak the words, no offering but my own bread. I leave this stone from the banks of the Nile, so your spirit may feel the cool water and not thirst in the dry land. May you find the field of reeds, even from this red desert. Your son, Pepi. Asterisk. Ka read the simple, heartfelt words, and the stone walls of his heart finally crumbled. This was not a story of gods and judgment, of treasure and damnation. It was a story of love and loss. A son's desperate attempt to provide his father with a piece of home, a memory of water in a land of dust. He looked at the smooth river stone. It was an object of no monetary value, but it was the most precious treasure he had ever held. It was an offering given not out of duty or fear, but out of pure love. He gently rolled the scroll, retied it, and placed it back in the chest with the stone. He pushed the chest back into its resting place and began to wall up the opening, using rocks and dust. This time, as he worked, he was not sealing a crime or burying a ghost. He was protecting a memory. He was honoring a son's love. As he placed the last stone, he whispered into the darkness. May your spirit find the cool water, Anen, he said. It was a prayer, the first true prayer he had offered in his life. He turned back to his work, his hands steady. The ringing of the chisels no longer sounded like a torment. It sounded like a purpose. He would not spend his life running from the past. He would spend it honoring the small, forgotten stories of the dead, the simple human connections that endured even in the harshest of lands. He would be their keeper. He did not know if his soul would ever be lighter than a feather. He did not know if he would ever find peace. But as he worked in the red dust of the mine, a man with no name, he felt a flicker of something he had long thought lost. It was not hope. It was acceptance. And in the heart of the desert, that was enough. Years passed, measured not in calendars, but in the slow erosion of the mountainside and the deepening of the lines on Ash's face. He remained at the mines, a permanent, silent fixture in a world of transient suffering. The young Nubian boy he had once helped grew into a man and was eventually released. But Ash stayed. The Sinai had become his monastery, the mine his cloister. He had nowhere else to go. He became a legend of sorts among the ever-changing population of workers. They called him the Silent One or the Stone Watcher. They saw that he was different. While other men cursed their fate or dreamed of escape, Ash worked with a quiet, tireless dignity. He was the one who would take a moment to shore up a weak-looking tunnel support. The one who would share his water with a man suffering from the heat, the one who would close the eyes of the dead after a rockfall. These were small acts, unnoticed by the overseers, but they created a quiet circle of respect around him. His discovery of Anen's letter had fundamentally changed him. He no longer saw the world as a battle between his damned soul and the wrathful gods. He saw it as a tapestry of forgotten stories. Of loves and griefs buried under layers of stone and time. He began to look for them. He became an archaeologist of the human heart. When the gangs uncovered an old, collapsed shaft, he would volunteer for the dangerous work of clearing it. In the debris, he would find small, personal artifacts left behind by workers from centuries past, a broken pottery shard with a wife's name scratched into it, a single carnelian bead lost from a cheap necklace, a game piece carved from bone. He would gather these small treasures. He did not keep them. In a quiet, secluded part of the mines, he created a small, hidden cairn of stones. Here, he would place the objects, giving them a new, shared tomb. He was not praying, he was remembering. He was bearing witness for the forgotten. This secret ritual became the anchor of his existence. It was a penance, but not one of fear. It was an act of connection, a way of honoring the countless, nameless lives that had been spent and broken in this harsh place. He was repaying his debt to Baku not by begging forgiveness from the gods, but by honoring the humanity of the lost. One season, a new contingent of prisoners arrived from Thebes, men convicted of petty crimes and debt. Among them was a young man with the frightened eyes of a gazelle. clearly unsuited for the brutal life of the mines. He stumbled, he dropped his tools, he was a frequent target of the overseer's whips. Ash, breaking his long-held habit of silence, took the boy under his wing. He taught him how to read the rock, how to swing a mallet without wasting energy, how to find the coolest place to rest during the midday break. "Why do you help me?" the boy, whose name was Keba, asked one day, his voice filled with awe. Ash looked out at the vast, red expanse of the desert. "Because every stone has a story," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "And no one should have their story end unheard." Keba became his shadow, his apprentice. Through the boy's questions, Ash began to speak again, not of himself, but of the world. He taught Keba the names of the stars they could see from the bottom of the pits. The way the wind carved the sandstone, the different sounds a rock makes just before it gives way. He was passing on the wisdom of survival. One evening, Keba, emboldened by their strange friendship, asked the question no one else had dared. "Ash, what of your own story? Where is your home?" Ash was silent for a long time, watching the campfire embers glow and fade. He thought of a small mud brick hut. The sound of a girl's cough, the feel of an ivory amulet. He thought of the tomb, the fire, the darkness. "My home is a place I can never return to," he said softly. "I had a sister. Her name was Anapi. She was a bird in a cage of dust. I opened the cage for her. But the price was the sky." It was the most he had ever said about his past. The confession, small as it was, felt like a stone being lifted from his chest. Keba listened, his eyes wide, understanding not the details, but the weight of the sorrow behind the words. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken empathy. In that moment, Ash realized the caravan master had been wrong. You could never run away from yourself, that was true. But you could, perhaps, build a new self from the rubble of the old one. You could take the shattered pieces of a life and use them to build a monument. Not of stone or gold, but of memory and compassion. He was no longer Ka, the sinner. He was no longer Ash, the ghost. He was the stone watcher, the keeper of lost stories. His final judgment would not be in the hall of Ma'at, before the great gods. It was here, every day, in the red dust of the Sinai, in the quiet acts of remembrance for the forgotten and kindness for the living. His heart would always be heavy, but he had learned how to carry its weight. And as he looked up at the vast, star-filled sky, he felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more enduring than any he had ever known. His field of reeds was not a distant paradise. It was here, in the heart of the desert, where he had finally learned to make a life, not by taking, but by giving. The seasons of the desert continued their slow, relentless cycle. Keba, under Ash's quiet tutelage, grew harder, wiser. He learned to survive not just the physical brutality of the mines, but the spiritual erosion that claimed so many. He became the son Ash never had, and Ash the father Keba had lost. Their bond, forged in the dust and darkness, was a silent testament to the endurance of the human spirit. One year, a great sickness swept through the camp. A putrid fever that came from tainted water. It struck down workers and guards alike. The mines became a charnel house. The overseers, terrified of the plague, abandoned the lower galleries, leaving the sick and dying to their fate. Keba fell ill. The fever burned through him, leaving him delirious and weak. Ash nursed him with a fierce, desperate tenderness. He used his knowledge of desert plants, learned over years of solitary wandering, to brew bitter teas. He cleaned the boy's brow with precious water from his own ration. He sat with him through the long nights, whispering stories of the stars, trying to anchor the boy's wandering spirit to the world of the living. In his fever dreams, Keba spoke of Thebes. He spoke of the bustling markets, the scent of the river's inundation, the face of his mother. Ash listened, his heart aching. He was keeping the boy alive. But for what? To return to a life of toil in a dying camp? As the plague began to subside, leaving the mining operation in ruins, a decision was made by the distant authorities. The mine was no longer profitable. It was to be abandoned. The remaining healthy workers and guards were to be marched back to the settlements along the Nile. The sick were to be left behind. When Ash heard the decree, he knew he was facing his final test. He looked at Keba, who was frail and weak but whose fever had finally broken. The boy would not survive the march. To stay here meant certain death when the supplies ran out. That night, under the familiar cloak of a new moon, Ash made his preparations. He gathered 2 water skins, a small bag of roasted barley he had saved, and a length of sturdy rope. He went to Keba's side. "Wake up, my son," he whispered, shaking the boy gently. "It is time to walk." Keba's eyes fluttered open. "Walk where?" "They are leaving us to die." "The overseers are leaving you," Ash corrected him. "I am not. We are going home." "Home?" Keba whispered, the word full of a longing that was almost painful. "Home," Ash affirmed. He lifted the boy, who was light as a bundle of reeds, and settled him on his back. Keba was too weak to walk. But Ash's back was still strong. He had carried the weight of his guilt for a lifetime. He could carry this boy. He slipped out of the dying camp, avoiding the disorganized remnants of the guard. He did not head east into the deep desert. He headed west, back towards the Nile, back towards the world he had fled so long ago. The journey was an ordeal that dwarfed any day of labor he had ever known. The desert, which had been his monastery, now became his adversary. He was no longer just responsible for himself. He carried another life on his shoulders. He measured their progress not in miles, but in sips of water. He navigated by the sun and stars, the ancient map of the heavens his only guide. During the day, he would find what little shade he could and rest, shielding Keba from the worst of the sun. At night, he would walk, the boy's light weight a constant, precious burden. Keba would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring stories of his childhood, sometimes calling out for his mother. In those moments, Ash was not the stone watcher. He was just a father, comforting his child. He told Keba stories to keep his spirits up. Not stories of gods and pharaohs, but the stories he had collected over the years. The story of Anen and the river stone. The story of the woman whose name was scratched on a pottery shard. He gave the boy the gift of memory, the legacy of the forgotten. After weeks that felt like a lifetime, when their water was nearly gone and Ash's strength was beginning to fail, he saw it. A thin, dark green line on the horizon. The valley of the Nile. He half walked, half stumbled the last few miles. His body screaming in protest, his vision blurring. He reached the outskirts of a small farming village, a place of mud brick houses and the rich, fertile smell of the black earth. He collapsed near the village well, gently lowering Keba to the ground. Villagers gathered around them, their faces a mixture of pity and suspicion. They saw 2 men who looked as if they had been spat out by the desert itself. An old woman brought them water, and the taste of it, cool and sweet and free of grit, was the taste of life itself. Keba, revived by the water, was able to speak. He told them their story, or a version of it. He told them of the plague at the mines, of the abandonment, of how this silent, strong man had carried him across the desert to save his life. He did not call him Ash. He called him Father. The villagers, people who understood the harshness of life and the value of loyalty, took them in. They gave them food and shelter. As Ash lay on a soft reed mat, his exhausted body finally surrendering to rest, he knew he had completed his journey. He had walked out of the desert not as a fugitive, but as a redeemer. He had not saved his own soul, but he had saved another's. And in doing so, he had found a kind of grace. He did not know what the future held. Perhaps he would stay in this village, living out his days as a quiet farmer. Perhaps he would journey to Thebes to ensure Keba found his family. It did not matter. The running was over. He thought of the scales in the hall of Ma'at. His heart was still heavy with the memory of Baku, with the weight of his sins. But now, there was something else on the other side of the scale. A boy's life. A son's love for his father. A lifetime of quiet atonement. He did not know if it would be enough to balance the scales. But as he drifted into a peaceful, dreamless sleep, for the first time in his life, he felt it might be. The village of Perhapi was a world away from the dust and stone of both the necropolis and the mines. Here, the rhythm of life was dictated by the Nile's gentle rise and fall, not the crack of an overseer's whip. The air smelled of wet earth, growing things, and the soft scent of lotus blossoms from the canals. For Ash, it was like learning to breathe again. He and Keba stayed. The villagers, moved by their story, offered them a small, abandoned hut to mend and a patch of land to work. Ash, whose hands had only known the unforgiving hardness of stone, now learned the soft yield of the black soil. He learned to guide a wooden plow, to cast seeds, to mend irrigation ditches. The work was still hard, but it was creative. It was work that nurtured life instead of serving death. Keba slowly regained his strength. The color returned to his face, and the light to his eyes. He worked alongside Ash in the fields, his gratitude a constant, quiet presence between them. He stopped calling Ash father, sensing it was a name that carried too much weight, and instead simply called him by the name the caravan master had given him. In this new life, he was Ash, the farmer. Ash found a measure of peace he had never thought possible. The nightmares did not vanish entirely, but they came less frequently. When they did, he would wake not in a cold sweat of terror, but with a quiet, aching sadness. He would rise from his mat and walk to the edge of the fields, looking west, towards the distant, unseen hills of Thebes. He was a man looking at a scar, a wound that had healed but would always be a part of him. He never spoke of Deir el-Medina or the tomb. That part of his life was a sealed chamber, its secrets known only to him. But sometimes, as he worked the soil, his fingers would close around a smooth, gray river stone, and he would hold it for a moment, thinking of Anen and his son. He would think of all the small, forgotten stories buried beneath the great monuments of his land. One season, a traveling merchant passed through the village, his boat laden with goods from the south and the north. Keba, now a young man full of life, went to the market to trade their surplus grain. He returned not with tools or linen, but with a small, stringed instrument. A simple lute. That evening, as the sun set over the palm trees, Keba sat outside their hut and began to play. He was not a skilled musician, but he played a simple, haunting melody he had learned as a child. It was the same song Ash had heard so long ago, drifting from the caravan fire in the desert. Ash sat and listened, his eyes closed. The music was not a lament of hardship, it was a song of resilience. Of love, of home. It was the music of life itself. In that moment, he thought of Anapi. He did not know her fate. He hoped her life had been long and happy, that she had married and had children of her own, that she sometimes thought of her strange, angry brother who had vanished into the desert. He hoped the amulet of Bes had kept her safe. He sent a silent wave of love and apology out into the twilight. Keba finished his song and looked at Ash. "It is a sad tune," the young man said. "No," Ash replied, his voice soft. He opened his eye, and for the first time, it was clear of the shadows of the past. "It is not sad. It is a story. And it has a beautiful ending." He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his own story had reached its end as well. He was an old man now. His body ached, and his strength was fading. But his spirit was, at last, at peace. He had crossed his desert, he had atoned for his sins not with prayers to the gods, but with service to man. He had found a son. He had built a life. He looked up at the first stars appearing in the deep indigo sky. He was not afraid of the judgment that awaited him. He had faced his own deeds, carried his own guilt, and found his own measure of grace in the small, quiet acts of a humble life. His heart was heavy, yes, but it was also full. And he knew, when he finally stood in the great hall, that it would be enough. The scales would balance. Story 2. Do you know what stone sounds like? It sounds like silence. Not the gentle quiet of a sleeping house, but the dense, heavy silence of a riverbed, where countless pebbles lie smooth and mute under the crushing weight of the water. My name is Ishi, and I have made my life in that silence. For 30 years, I have been the woman they call when the whispers in the tea-houses of Yoshiwara turn from silk and poetry to blood and fear. I am a midwife of endings, an herbalist of secrets. I am the stone they throw into the river to make the ripples disappear. The evening air in the first month was a shard of ice against the skin. Winter held Yoshiwara in a tight fist, its chill seeping through the thin paper screens and settling deep into the bones. From my small room, tucked away in an alley so narrow the sky was just a bruised sliver overhead, I could hear the district's heartbeat, the distant, mournful pluck of a shamisen, the forced laughter from a high-walled house, the clatter of wooden geta on the frozen ground. These were the sounds of the floating world, a world I had once danced in. Now, I listened only to its undertones, the notes of desperation that others chose to ignore. My room smelled of bitter herbs and damp earth. Bundles of mugwort, safflower, and dried ginger hung from the low ceiling like sleeping bats. A blackened iron pot simmered over a charcoal brazier, its contents a murky, secret brew. I was grinding licorice root in a stone suribachi. The rhythmic scrape of pestle against bowl a familiar prayer in the quiet. A young courtesan, barely a woman, had just left. Her ailment was a simple cough, a common complaint in the biting cold, but her eyes held a deeper fright. I gave her a warming syrup and sent her away, knowing she would be back in a year, or two, for a different kind of remedy. They all came back. After I had cleaned the bowl, I noticed it. Tucked into the crack of my sliding door was a single, pressed chrysanthemum leaf. Its edges were brown and brittle, a ghost of its autumn glory. It was a summons. I knew the Mon, the crest of the House of Falling Petals, one of the most prestigious brothels in the district. Chrysanthemums were for the highest ranking, the most expensive, the girls who were supposed to be as flawless as porcelain dolls. Porcelain, I knew, could shatter. Wrapping a plain, dark haori over my patched kimono, I stepped outside. The cold was a physical blow. The alleys of Yoshiwara were a treacherous maze, slick with frozen muck and shadowed by the overhanging eaves of the great houses. This was my world, the Yura, the hidden back of the glittering facade. Here, the glamour was stripped away, leaving only the functional grime of survival. As I navigated the familiar path, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows. Kenji. He was an enforcer for the House of Falling Petals, a man whose presence was as silent and solid as a graveyard stone. He didn't wear the silks of the samurai or the finery of the merchants. He wore plain, dark clothes that let him melt into the night. He merely nodded as I passed, but his eyes, small and sharp, followed me. They missed nothing. He was the district's immune system, searching for any sign of infection, any disruption to the profitable fantasy. I was a fever he could not yet name. I was led not through the front entrance, with its glowing lanterns and bowing servants, but through a narrow side door that smelled of cooking oil and disappointment. The corridors were cold and drafty, a stark contrast to the warmth and laughter that bled through the paper walls from the front rooms where clients were being entertained. I was shown into a small, bare room at the very back of the house. She was waiting. Kiku. Her name meant chrysanthemum, but tonight she was a flower on the verge of being crushed. She couldn't have been more than 18. She sat on the tatami floor, a vision of impossible beauty in a layered kimono of cream and gold silk, her hair a lacquered sculpture of pins and combs. But her face was pale beneath the white powder, and her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the air from the room. "Ishi-sama," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. I knelt before her, my old bones protesting. I placed my simple medicine box on the floor between us. I received the leaf. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to ruin the perfect lines of black paint at their corners. They say you can help. I looked at her, at the perfect silk, the powdered neck, the trembling hands. I had seen this girl 100 times before. She was every girl. Help is a strong word, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. I offer solutions. They are not gentle. She began to speak, the story tumbling out in a rush of whispered fear. A merchant's son, a promise of a different life. A few weeks of stolen happiness. Now, he was gone, and her monthly blood had not come. She still held on to a thread of hope so thin it was transparent. He said he would come back for me, Ishisama. He said he loved me. He is a ghost, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Forget him. Ghosts cannot save you. In that moment, a memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced the careful wall I had built around my past. Asterisk laughter. Sunlight streaming into a warm room. Another girl's face, bright with a similar, foolish hope. Her name was Hannah, asterisk I pushed the thought away, locking it back in its dark box. Please, Kiku begged, her composure finally breaking. A single tear traced a path through her makeup. The Okasan. Madame Ayano, she has been watching me. If she finds out, she didn't need to finish. I knew what would happen. Debt, demotion, ruin. A living artwork becoming an unmarketable liability. I opened my box. The scent of dried herbs filled the small space. There is a tea, I began, my voice flat and clinical. It is bitter. It may feel like your insides are being torn out. You will bleed for days. You must not cry out. You must smile for your clients and tell them you have a chill. Can you do that? She looked from my face to the packet of dark, twisted leaves I held out to her. It was a choice between a slow ruin and a swift, agonizing pain. She nodded, her entire body trembling. As I left the brothel, slipping back into the frozen labyrinth of the alleys, I felt Kenji's eyes on me again. He was standing across the narrow way, a motionless shadow. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew my visit was not for a simple cough. The game had begun. And in this game, the stone does not get to choose where it falls. The first brew failed. 2 weeks later, another pressed leaf appeared at my door, this one more crumpled, more desperate. Kiku's message was simple, the bleeding had been slight, a false promise, and now the sickness in her stomach each morning was a constant, terrifying secret to keep. When I saw her again, the fragile hope in her eyes had been replaced by a raw, animal fear. She had lost weight, and the hollows beneath her cheekbones were more pronounced. It didn't work, she whispered, her hands gripping the sleeves of my plain kimono. Ishisama, what do I do? Patience, I said, though I felt none. I gave her a stronger mixture, one with more safflower, warning her that it would burn hotter, twist deeper. As I measured out the herbs, my own hands trembled slightly. I saw Hannah's face again, her skin clammy with sweat, her lips pale. Asterisk it hurts, Ishi. It hurts, asterisk. The days that followed were a torment of waiting. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing Yoshiwara in a deceptive purity. The world seemed muffled, quiet, holding its breath. I found myself watching the entrances to the House of Falling Petals, a foolish, dangerous habit. On one occasion, I saw Madame Ayano standing on the veranda, her silhouette sharp against the glowing shoji screens. She was a woman carved from ice, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She was watching the street, her gaze sweeping over the few patrons braving the cold. She was a spider, sensing the slightest tremor in her web. Kenji's presence became more overt. He began frequenting the small noodle shop across from my alley. I would see him through my screen. Sitting alone, nursing a single cup of sake for an hour, his eyes fixed on my door. He was not threatening me directly. It was a quieter, more patient form of intimidation. A warning. He was a hunter who was content to let his quarry exhaust itself. One afternoon, He stopped me as I returned from the market, my basket filled with radishes and burdock root. "A hard winter, old woman," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at me, but at the basket. "Good for roots. They grow deep when the ground is cold." "They do," I replied, my heart a cold knot in my chest. "The House of Falling Petals values its garden," he continued, his gaze finally meeting mine. It was as sharp and empty as a shard of obsidian. "Madame Ayano does not tolerate weeds. They must be pulled before they can choke the blossoms." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. I nodded and walked away, my limp more pronounced than usual. He knew I was the gardener of secrets. The second brew failed as well. This time, Kiku's message was a frantic scrawl, delivered by a terrified servant girl. The sickness was worse. She had fainted during a shamisen lesson. Madame Ayano had confined her to her room, claiming she was on retreat for her health. Everyone knew what that meant. It was a deadline. Handle it, or be handled. I knew the T's were not enough. The next step was more dangerous, a method that required a different kind of courage, a different kind of pain. A method that had cost Hannah her life. The memory came unbidden, a tidal wave of guilt. Hannah, her body contorting on the tatami. The crude metal tool in my shaking hand. I was young. Terrified, relying on the whispered instructions of an old woman who had since died. There was too much blood. Her scream, muffled by a silk cloth, was the last sound she ever made. I had run, leaving her there. I had run from her ghost for 30 years, I sat in my cold room, the charcoal in the brazier long dead. I could not do it. I could not be that person again. I would send a message to Kiku. I would tell her to run, to become a Nijihoro, a runaway prostitute. It was a fool's hope, a different kind of death sentence, but it was not a death by my hand. But as I prepared to write the note, a small, desperate sound came from my door. A scratching, like a trapped animal. It was Kiku. She had slipped out, disguised in a servant's plain clothes, her magnificent hair hidden under a scarf. Her face was a mess of tears and smeared powder. "She knows," Kiku sobbed, collapsing at my feet. "Ayano-sama knows. She gave me until the next full moon. Ishi-sama, there is nowhere to run. Please. You are my only hope." She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the single flickering candle in my room. In their depths, I did not see Kiku. I saw Hannah. And I knew I could not run from her ghost a second time. My penance was not to flee, but to face it. "There is another way," I said. My voice sounding like it came from a great distance. "It will require more than you believe you can bear." I looked at my hands, the hands that had failed once before. "And more than I can promise to give." The blizzard arrived on the night of the full moon, a shrieking ghost of wind and snow that clawed at the city. It was a good night for secrets. The narrow alleys of Yoshiwara were empty, the sounds of the district swallowed by the storm's fury. Inside my small room, the air was thick with a tension so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The only light came from a single oil lamp, its flame dancing wildly, casting long, monstrous shadows on the paper walls. Kiku lay on a thick futon on the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I had smuggled her out of the House of Falling Petals hours earlier, a desperate flight through the storm's embrace. I had created a diversion, an overturned brazier in a refuse pile that sent smoke billowing into the brothel's rear courtyard. In the ensuing chaos, we had slipped away, two ghosts in a world of white. Now, that world had shrunk to the confines of this room. The birth was not coming easily. It was a brutal, bloody battle. Kiku's body, so young and accustomed to the rigid control of the courtesan's life, fought against this raw, primal act. Her pain was immense. She bit down on a rolled-up cloth to muffle her screams, her body arching on the futon, her knuckles white where she gripped the thick cotton. I worked with a grim, focused energy. My hands, which had trembled with memory just weeks before, were now steady. This was my penance, and I would not fail again. I wiped her brow with a cool cloth. Whispered instructions, pressed on her belly. The room smelled of sweat, blood, and the bitter herbs I had simmering to staunch the bleeding that would follow. Every gust of wind that rattled the door made my heart leap into my throat. We were an island of forbidden life in an ocean of swirling death. Hours crawled by. The storm howled. Kiku's strength was fading. She was delirious, muttering the name of the merchant who had abandoned her. Her pleas lost in the folds of the cloth in her mouth. My own past was a constant presence in the room, a third phantom hovering in the shadows. I saw Hannah's face superimposed over Kiku's, her silent scream echoing in my mind. Not again, I chanted to myself, a silent, desperate prayer. Not this time. Then, a sound. Not the wind. A distinct, rhythmic clack-clack of wooden geta, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside my door. My blood ran cold. It was Kenji. Kiku's eyes shot open, wide with a new, lucid terror. She had heard it too. We both froze, a tableau of shared dread. The storm was his cover. No one would question the enforcer making his rounds on such a night, ensuring the district's assets were secure. He was just being thorough. I placed a finger to my lips, my eyes locked on the paper door, where his silhouette was a dark, menacing shape against the swirling snow. He stood there for a lifetime. A minute. An eternity. He was listening. And at that precise moment, Kiku's body gave one final, violent heave. The child was coming. I had to act, to guide it, but any sound, any sudden movement, could betray us. I moved with a slowness that felt like moving through water, my hands finding their place. The baby emerged into the world. Silent and still. Too still. Its skin was a pale, bluish color. It wasn't breathing. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my practiced calm. I had to make it cry. I had to clear its lungs. But a cry would be our death sentence. Kenji was still there, a patient predator outside the screen. I looked at Kiku. She was fading, her eyes glassy, a fresh wave of blood soaking the cloths beneath her. She was hemorrhaging. I had to choose. The mother or the child. My promise to Kiku or the tiny, silent life in my hands. Hannah's ghost whispered in my ear. Save her. I made my choice. My duty was to the living, to the girl who had placed her trust in me. But as I turned to pack Kiku's womb with moss and herbs, the infant in my arms gave a tiny, convulsive shudder. Its small mouth opened, and it let out a thin, wavering wail, as fragile as a bird's cry. Outside, the silhouette of Kenji shifted. He had heard it. He placed a hand on the frame of my door. I acted on pure instinct. I cupped my hand over the baby's mouth and nose, cutting off the sound, cutting off its breath. I pressed its face into the thick folds of my kimono, my heart hammering against my ribs. My other hand flew to Kiku, pressing, packing, fighting the flow of her lifeblood. The room was a vortex of silent screams. The baby struggled weakly against me, its tiny body a frantic pulse of life I was extinguishing. Kiku's eyes rolled back in her head. The hand on the door remained. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears. I was killing one to save the other, becoming the monster I had run from for 30 years. Then, slowly, the hand withdrew. The silhouette hesitated, then turned. The clack-clack of his geta resumed, moving away, fading into the howl of the blizzard. He was gone. I gasped, my own lungs burning. I pulled my hand away from the baby's face. It was limp, motionless. For a terrible second, I thought I had succeeded. Then, its chest hitched. It took a ragged, shuddering breath, followed by another. Its eyes fluttered open. I looked down at the tiny, Wrinkled face, then at Kiku, who was pale and still, but whose bleeding had slowed to a manageable ooze. I had saved them both. But as I looked at my hands, covered in the blood of mother and child, I did not feel like a savior. I felt like I had traded one ghost for another. The silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a stone, settling at the bottom of a deep, dark river. The blizzard broke with the dawn. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the paper screen, illuminating a room that looked like a battlefield. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the lingering scent of fear. Kiku was alive. She slept a sleep so deep it was almost death, her face a pale, waxy mask. The baby, wrapped in old rags, slept in a wooden box I had padded with soft linen, its breathing shallow but steady. For 3 days. The world was the size of my room. I nursed Kiku with thin rice gruel and bitter strengthening teas. I cleaned the infant, fed it drops of sweetened water from a cloth, and kept it hidden when the rare client knocked on my door for a headache powder or a sleeping draught. During those 3 days, a strange, fragile domesticity took root in the small space. Kiku would watch me with the baby, her eyes holding a dazed, hollow expression. She never asked to hold it. She was a ghost haunting the edges of her own motherhood. We did not speak of the future. It was a cliff edge we both knew was there, but we did not dare look over. The baby was the problem that could not be solved. A liability with lungs. Its presence in Yoshiwara was an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of the floating world. There was no room for innocence here. On the 4th morning, Kiku spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp. "The shrine," she said, not looking at me, her eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling. "The one with the Jizo statues." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I had known this was the only path, the final, brutal solution the district offered its daughters. To leave the child at a koya, a place of abandonment, in the desperate hope that a kind stranger or a monk from the nearby temple might find it before the cold did. It was not an act of cruelty, but a final, twisted act of love. "Before the sun rises," she whispered. That night, I wrapped the baby in the cleanest, warmest rags I owned. Tucked into the folds, I placed a single, small, smooth river stone I had kept on my windowsill for years. A piece of myself. A silent prayer. An hour before dawn, the city was sheathed in a blue, ethereal light. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. I supported Kiku as we moved through the sleeping alleys. She was still weak, leaning on me heavily, her steps unsteady on the packed snow. She was a wraith in a borrowed dark cloak, her own beautiful kimonos left behind, relics of a life that no longer felt real. The shrine was on the outskirts of the district, where the world of pleasure bled into the ordinary world of fields and forests. It was little more than a small, weathered wooden structure and a row of 6 stone Jizo statues, the guardians of children and travelers. Their stone faces were worn smooth by years of wind and rain. Several wore faded red bibs, offerings from other mothers, other ghosts. The silence here was different from the silence in my room. It was older, deeper, saturated with unspoken grief. Kiku took the swaddled bundle from my arms. For the first time, she looked down at the child's face, its features peaceful in sleep. Her expression was unreadable. There were no tears. I think she had none left. She knelt in the snow, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed the infant at the feet of the largest Jizo statue. For a long moment, she stayed there, her hand resting on the bundle. A farewell without words. A goodbye that would echo for the rest of her life. Then, she stood up and walked away without looking back. That was the rule. You did not look back. I followed her, a silent shadow. We walked back to the house of falling petals, the sky beginning to pale in the east. At the rear gate, she turned to me. The serene, powdered mask of the courtesan was already beginning to settle back onto her features. The girl who had sobbed in my room was gone, buried beneath layers of duty and survival. "Ishisama," she said. Her voice formal, distant. She bowed deeply. It was not a bow of thanks. It was a bow of dismissal. Our secret was now a wall between us. We were strangers again. I watched her disappear inside the gate, a beautiful ghost returning to her beautiful prison. She would go back to her room, fix her hair, paint her face, and when she was called, she would smile and pour sake as if nothing had happened. She would endure. That was the terrible strength of the women in this world. I did not go straight home. I walked to the river, the one that flowed past the edge of the city. The water was dark and cold, chunks of ice floating on its surface. I found what I was looking for, a small, smooth, gray stone, worn by the current until it had no sharp edges left. It was cold to the touch. Back in my room, the lingering scent of milk and blood was already fading. The space felt empty, the silence heavier than before. I knelt and pried up the loose floorboard in the corner, revealing the dark, lacquered box beneath. I opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark cloth, lay dozens of other stones, each one a different shape, a different shade of gray, each one a silent testament. Each one a child. I placed the new stone among them. It made a soft, clicking sound as it settled. I looked at them, my collection of sorrows, my secret graveyard of ghosts. This was my penance. Not to forget, but to remember. To be the one who kept the tally of the forgotten. I closed the box, plunging them all back into darkness. The sun was rising, but in my room, it was always night. I was Ishi. The stone. And a stone does not feel. It only endures. Story 3. The wind had teeth. That was the first lesson of winter in Oakhaven. It did not simply blow, it gnawed. Site_start, it chewed at the wattleandaub walls, tasted the mud and dung smeared into the cracks, and searched tirelessly for a way inside the hut. Site 30, 31, 33. Elara, 19 years old and feeling every one of them like a stone on her back, knew the wind's nature intimately. She sat on a low stool, the fire at her front, the darkness at her back, and listened to its hungry howl. Site_start, this was the hour of the wolf. The deepest, darkest part of a January night where the cold was not just an absence of heat but an active, malevolent presence. Site 16. Site_start, it seeped up from the compacted earth floor, a phantom chill that no amount of straw could completely vanquish. Site 41, 49, 51. Inside the single, smoky room that was her world, 3 other heartbeats marked the time with her. There was Finn, her brother. All of 7 years, curled into a tight ball on the straw pallet they shared. He slept the fitful, twitching sleep of the young, his small breaths puffing into faint clouds in the frigid air. Beside him, their grandfather, Ulrich, coughed a deep, ragged sound that seemed to pull at the very foundations of his frail body. His was the sound of a winter that had already claimed too much. And in the far corner, separated by a low, wobbly partition of woven hazel, was the slow, rhythmic breathing of Maeve, the family's only cow. Site_start, her warmth was a second, smaller hearth, a living furnace whose gentle heat was as vital as the sputtering fire in the center of the room. Site 128, 137. Elara's gaze drifted from the sleeping forms to the fire. It was a meager thing, a few precious blocks of peat and a single, half-charred log she was rationing with the care of a royal treasurer. She was the keeper of the flame now. The thought came, unbidden and sharp as a shard of ice. Since her father had succumbed to the lung fever in autumn, that duty, like all the others, had fallen to her. The cold has no memory, Elara, he had whispered with his final, rattling breaths. But we must. She hadn't understood the words then. Not fully. Now, they were her mantra. She was the memory. She had to remember how much peat was left, how much salted pork was in the barrel, how many days until the wolf moon waned. Site_start, she had to remember the particular way her father would bank the embers in ash to keep them alive till morning, a skill she was still trying to master. Sight, 92, 93, 96. Her body ached with a weariness that went beyond tired muscles. It was the weariness of constant vigilance. Her eyes, a pale, watchful gray that matched the winter sky, scanned the small hut, noting every potential failure. Sight_start, a loose patch of daub near the roof, a faint drip of melted frost from the thatch, the way the hide over the small window hole shivered with each gust of wind. Sight, 36, 38. Her gaze settled on the hearth. Sight_start, it was the heart of their home. Their only true defense. Sight, 68. But it was a fickle heart. She poked the log with a stick, turning it to expose a new face to the embers. The fire flared for a moment, painting the smoke-blackened rafters in dancing shades of orange and red, and then settled back into its sullen glow. The log was old, dry, and riddled with fissures. She'd found it by the river 2 months ago, a gift from the receding autumn floods. A good, solid log. She must have dozed. She never meant to, but the droning of the wind and the oppressive dark could pull your eyelids down like lead weights. One moment she was watching the hypnotic dance of the embers, the next she was jolted awake by a sound that did not belong to the night symphony of wind and coughing. A sharp, violent crack, like a bone snapping. Her eyes flew open. The log in the hearth had split. A shower of angry, red-gold embers arced through the air, a beautiful, terrifying constellation. Time seemed to slow. She watched them fly, mesmerized for a fatal second. Most fell harmlessly into the ash, but a dozen others sailed further, landing on the dry, brittle thatch woven into the wattle of the interior wall. The wall right behind Maeve. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a single, tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards. Another followed. A small, orange serpent of flame slithered up a strand of straw. No, Elara breathed, the word a puff of smoke in the cold. The serpent grew, fattening itself on the dry thatch. It licked at the soot-stained wood of the hut's frame. The smell of burning straw, sharp and acrid, cut through the familiar scent of wood smoke and livestock. "Grandfather," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Fire!" She scrambled from her stool, grabbing the half-full bucket of water by the door. It was their drinking water, precious and hard one, but there was no choice. She threw it, and the icy splash hissed as it hit the flames. It killed the main fire, but left smaller ones flickering, eating their way into the wall. Maeve, trapped in her small enclosure, was lowing now, a sound of pure terror, her large eyes wide and white in the dim light. Finn was awake, sitting bolt upright, his small cry lost in the noise. "The blankets!" Auric yelled, his voice surprisingly strong as he struggled to his feet. He grabbed their only 2 homespun wool blankets from the pallet, coughing violently. "Soak them." Elara didn't hesitate. She plunged the rough fabric into the remaining water, the icy shock barely registering. They were heavy and dripping. She and Auric beat at the remaining flames. The wet thud of the blankets against the wall a desperate drumbeat. Smoke filled the hut, thick and choking. Sight_start, it burned her lungs and made her eyes stream with tears. Sight, 71, 73. She couldn't see, could only hear Finn's terrified sobs and Maeve's panicked bellows. Finally, the last of the flames died. They stood in the near darkness, gasping for air, the silence broken only by coughing and the unabated shriek of the wind. But the wind was louder now. Much louder. Elara's heart sank. She turned towards the source of the sound. Where the fire had been, there was now a gaping, blackened hole in the wall, easily the width of her shoulders. The night stared in at them, and the wind, no longer needing to search for a way in, poured into their sanctuary like a conquering army. The fragile warmth they had hoarded was gone in an instant. The fire had been put out. But the cold had just begun its true assault. Maeve let out a long, shuddering cough, a sound thick with smoke and fear, her flank singed and raw where the heat had licked too close. The night of the split log was over, but the fight for their lives had just begun. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic ballet of shivering misery. The wind, a tangible beast, now occupied the hut with them. It swirled around their ankles, snatched the breath from their lips, and made the pitiful embers of the hearth dance and sputter as if in fear. Finn was crying openly now, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Alric, after his burst of frantic energy, had slumped back onto the pallet, a fit of coughing shaking his thin frame so violently Elara feared he might come apart. The bench, she gasped, her mind racing past the panic to find the cold, hard ground of practicality her father had always stood upon. "Grandfather, help me with the bench." Together, they dragged the heavy, crude wooden bench, their only table, their only real piece of furniture, and wedged it into the lower half of the gaping hole. It was a pathetic defense. Elara then ripped the hide from the window opening and frantically used strips of leather cord to lash it over the top half. The wind billowed against it, straining the cords, but it held. It was a bandage on a mortal wound, but it was better than nothing. The direct assault of the wind was lessened, but the cold still poured through 100 new gaps. "Elara," Finn whimpered, crawling towards her. "I'm cold." "I know." She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, but her own body felt like a block of ice. There was no warmth to give. The smoke still hung in the air, thick and acrid. Her eyes stung, and a deep, rattling cough had taken root in her own chest. She looked over at Maeve. The poor creature was pressed against the far wall of her enclosure, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. The smell of burnt hair and flesh was nauseating. There would be no more sleep that night. They huddled together by the dying fire, feeding it every last scrap of wood and peat they owned, knowing that tomorrow's cold would be met with an empty fuel store. They watched the hide over the whole billow and snap, and listened to the endless howl of the wind, a predator circling its wounded prey. Dawn arrived not as a promise but as an accusation. The pale, gray light revealed the full extent of the disaster. The wall was a blackened, skeletal ruin of charred wattle. The hut, which had always felt small, now felt fragile, on the verge of collapse. And the cold was absolute. "I have to fix it," Elara said, her voice hoarse. Alric looked at her, his eyes rheumy but sharp. "The mud is frozen. The river is ice. What will you use for daub?" She remembered her father's words from a previous winter, his voice a low murmur by the fire. "In the worst cold, you use what you have. You use the earth itself. You use its heat." At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, she did. "The dung," she said, her gaze turning to Maeve's enclosure. "And snow. And the earth beneath the fire." It was grueling, soul-crushing work. She took their only spade and broke through the frozen crust of the floor to get to the damper, warmer earth near the hearth pit. She mixed it with snow, which numbed her hands until they were clumsy, useless claws. Then came the worst part. Site_start, she had to gather Maeve's precious dung, the only insulator she had, Site 31-32. She mixed it all into a thick, foul-smelling slurry. Finn, seeing her struggle, tried to help, his small hands packing the freezing mud into the gaps between the charred sticks. But after a few minutes, his fingers were blue, and she had to send him back inside to huddle with Alric. She worked alone, the biting wind stealing the warmth from her body faster than the physical exertion could create it. She plastered the grotesque mixture onto the wall, her hands burning with cold, tears of frustration freezing on her cheeks. It was a hideous, lumpy patch. It would not be strong. But it was a wall. As the weak afternoon sun began to fade, she finished. Exhausted, filthy, and chilled to the bone, she stumbled back into the hut. The immediate blast of the wind was gone, but the atmosphere inside was grim. Alric was asleep, his breathing shallow. Finn was huddled under a blanket, shivering. And Maeve was worse. Much worse. The cow lay on her side, a position Alara had never seen her take before. Her wheezing had turned into a deep, wet rattle that echoed Ulrich's own cough. The burn on her flank, a hand-sized patch of raw, weeping skin, was angry and red. She had not eaten the small handful of hay Alara had given her. She had not even drunk any water. Her great, gentle brown eyes were glazed with fever. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's exhaustion. Maeve was not just their only significant possession, she was the living promise of their future. Her milk would feed them in the spring. Her calf, if she had one, would be wealth. Site_start, her warmth was a bulwark against the winter night, Site, 128. If Maeve died, a part of their own hope for survival would die with her. That evening, the fragile warmth Maeve's body usually provided was gone. The hut felt twice as cold. The family's own survival was now tied directly to the fading life of the animal in the corner. The next day, desperation drove Alara. She left a sleeping Finn in the care of Ulrich, who seemed a little stronger, and trudged through the knee-deep snow towards the center of the village. There was only one person who could help her, and he was the last person she wanted to ask. Reeve Morwen's house was not a hut. It was a longhouse, built with sturdy timber beams and thick, well-maintained walls of daub and stone. Site_start, a thin tendril of smoke curled from a proper smoke hole in its roof. A luxury peasants could only dream of. Site, 72. Morwen stood outside, his stout frame wrapped in a cloak of dark, heavy wool that had clearly never been used to beat out a fire. He was overseeing two other men salting a pig. He saw Alara approach, and his small, shrewd eyes narrowed. "Reeve Morwen," she began, her voice barely a whisper in the wind. "What is it, girl?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the weary impatience of a busy man. She swallowed her pride, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's my cow, Maeve. There was a fire. She's taken a sickness from the smoke. Her flank is burned. I need herbs for a poultice. Yarrow, for the fever. Comfrey, for the burn. I will work it off. In the spring, I will." Morwen held up a hand, stopping her. He wiped his greasy fingers on his cloak and looked at her, his gaze missing nothing, her ragged clothes, the soot on her face, the desperation in her eyes. "A fire," he said, his voice flat. "I heard the commotion. Your father was a good man, Alara, but he is gone. Your household is now a weak link." "We are not weak," she said, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "The wall is patched. We will survive. Will you?" Morwen's gaze was cold as the iron sky. "The village survives the winter because the strong help the strong. We cannot afford to waste our stores on failing stock. The herbs are for the oxen that will plow the fields in the spring. They are for the breeding ewes. They are for productive assets, not for a dying cow in a failing household." His words were not just a refusal, they were a judgment. He was writing them off, leaving them for the cold to claim. "Please," she whispered, the defiance draining out of her. "She provides warmth for my brother, for my grandfather. The strong survive the winter by not sharing their warmth with the cold," he said, turning his back on her. "Go home, girl. Pray to your God. It's all you have left." She stood there for a long moment, the Reeves' dismissal hanging in the air like frozen breath. He was wrong. Prayer wasn't all she had left. She had her father's memory. And with that memory came a sudden, sharp recollection. A dangerous one. Her father, kneeling by the frozen river in the last days of autumn. He was peeling something from the underside of a flat, gray stone. A lichen, pale as bone, almost luminous in the fading light. "The old ones use this, Alara," he'd said, his voice low. "The priests say it's devil's work. But it can draw the fire from a fever when nothing else will. You must be careful. Too much, and it draws the life out, too. He had never told her how much was too much. As she trudged back to the hut, the wind whipping her cloak around her, a desperate resolve began to form. Reeve Morwen had left her with nothing. Her father had left her with a risk. In a world of cold, hard certainties, a risk felt like the only thing that might still have warmth in it. She would go to the river. The walk to the river was a battle in itself. The snow was deep, a thick, soft blanket that hid the treacherous, frozen ruts of the path. Every step was a gamble. Elara moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone conserving every flicker of energy. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of gray, and the air had a heavy stillness to it, a silence that felt more menacing than the wind's howl. A storm was coming. The village elders could feel it in their joints. Elara could feel it in the air, a gathering of power, a deep intake of breath before the world screamed. She reached the riverbank, a stark line of black rock and skeletal willows against the endless white. The river was not completely frozen, a dark, sluggish channel of water moving under a skin of ice. She remembered where she had seen her father, a small cove where flat, gray stones littered the bank like sleeping sheep. Kneeling in the snow, her fingers already numb, she began turning them over. One after another, they were bare, slick with a thin layer of ice. Despair began to prickle at the edges of her resolve. What if she had remembered wrong? What if the lichen only grew in autumn? Then she saw it. On the underside of a large, flat stone, nestled against the frozen earth, was a patch of the stuff. It was exactly as she remembered. A pale, ghostly gray-green, its texture like dry, brittle lace. It looked like nothing, like something that grew on graves. The devil's work, the priest would say. Elara hesitated for only a moment. The devil, or the cold? It was hardly a choice. Carefully, she scraped a small handful of the lichen into a leather pouch, its touch strangely dry and cool against her frozen fingers. As she straightened up, the first snowflake landed on her cheek. It was not a gentle, drifting flake, but a hard, stinging pellet of ice. Another followed, then a dozen more. The air, which had been still, began to move. A low moan started in the distant hills, and within minutes, it grew into a piercing shriek. The blizzard was here. She turned and ran, stumbling through the deepening snow, the wind now a solid wall pushing against her. The short journey back to the hut became a pilgrimage through a white, roaring hell. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. She navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath the snow, her hand held out in front of her like a blind woman. When she finally stumbled through the hide flap of the hut, she was more a creature of snow and ice than a girl. She collapsed to the floor. Gasping, the precious pouch of lichen clutched in her fist. The world inside was even bleaker than when she had left. The crude patch on the wall was failing. Sight_start, a fine powder of snow was being driven through a dozen tiny cracks, dusting the floor and their blankets. Sight, 212. The fire was a pathetic circle of glowing embers, emitting no heat, only a faint, pulsing light. Alric was awake. His face gray with worry. Finn was a small, silent lump under a blanket. "The storm is on us," Alric croaked. "I know." Elara pushed herself up. There was no time for rest. She went to Maeve's side. The cow's condition was dire. Her breathing was a shallow, liquid rattle. Her skin was hot to the touch, but a deep, deathly chill seemed to radiate from her body. Her eyes were closed. "She is leaving us," Alric whispered from across the room. No, the word was hard. A stone thrown against the wind. Elara would not allow it. She had the lichen. She had her father's last, desperate piece of knowledge. The narrative of the night became a series of small, desperate actions, each one played out against the deafening roar of the blizzard. The hut was an island in a sea of roaring white, and Elara was its frantic, solitary defender. First, the fire. Their fuel was almost gone. Elara broke their last stool, feeding the dry, splintered wood to the embers. The fire sprang to life, a temporary reprieve. Then, the remedy. Her hands shaking, Elara crushed the dry lichen with a stone. She mixed it with a little snow, melting it into a thick, gray paste. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and strange. Too much, and it draws the life out, too, her father's warning echoed in her head. How much was too much? She had no way of knowing. She was working blind, guided only by a dead man's fragmented memory and her own fierce hope. She approached Maeve. The cow did not stir. Elara forced her great jaws open and pushed a small amount of the paste inside. Then, she took the rest and smeared it over the hot, weeping burn on the animal's flank. Maeve shuddered, a long, deep tremor that ran through her whole body. Her breath hitched. For a terrifying moment, Elara thought she had killed her. The cow lay still, the only movement the faint, shallow rise and fall of her ribs. The wind hammered at the hut, a relentless, physical assault. A larger section of her wall patch gave way, and a torrent of snow poured in. The fire hissed and shrank as the snow hit the hearth. "It's too cold," Finn cried from under his blanket. "I can't get warm." Elara looked at her family, huddled near a fire that was losing its battle. She looked at the great, still form of the cow, from whom a palpable cold now seemed to flow. Logic, the cold logic of Reeve Morwen, dictated their course: huddle together, hoard their warmth, and let the dying animal die. Turn their backs on the cold. But her father's other lesson surfaced. The cold has no memory. But we must, they had to remember they were not just individuals. They were a family. And Maeve was part of that family. Her warmth had sustained them. Now, they had to sustain her. In that moment, a new, terrifying, and radical idea took hold. An idea that defied all the conventional wisdom of survival she had ever known. Survival wasn't just about hoarding heat. What if it was about spending it? What if you fought the cold not by turning from it, but by facing it, and pushing your own life force against it? "Grandfather," she said, her voice clear and sharp above the storm. "Finn. Get your blankets. We're moving." "To where?" Alric asked, his voice full of confusion. "The fire is here." "The fire is dying," Elara said, her gaze fixed on the still form of the cow. "We have to make our own." She took Finn by the hand and led him away from the hearth, towards the great, dark mass of the dying animal. She pulled the blankets from their sleeping pallet. "Lie down," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Here." Against her. Alric stared at her as if she were mad. "Girl, she is dying. Her cold will kill us." "Her warmth has kept us alive," Elara countered, her eyes blazing with a feverish intensity. "Now we will keep her alive. We will give our warmth to her. Lie down." It was a terrible gamble, a desperate act of faith against all reason. They were three small, flickering flames, and they were about to press themselves against a mountain of ice. But Alric, seeing the unwavering resolve in his granddaughter's face, a resolve he recognized from his own son, slowly, painfully, obeyed. Elara lay Finn down first, pressing his small, shivering body against Maeve's vast, still flank. Then she helped Alric lie down on the other side. Finally, she lay down herself, curling her body around Finn's, creating a small pocket of shared human warmth. She pulled their two thin blankets and her own cloak over all three of them, and over the cow. They were a single, huddling mass in the freezing, roaring dark. The cold from Maeve's body was a physical shock, leaching their heat, seeping into their bones. Finn whimpered. Alric's teeth chattered. Elara closed her eyes, shutting out the darkness, and focused. She focused on her own heartbeat, on Finn's, on Alric's. She tried to feel Maeve's. She imagined their collective warmth as a tiny, fragile sun. She pictured it flowing from them, into the great, cold body of the cow, a desperate transfusion of life. The storm raged. The fire dwindled to nothing but a few faint red eyes in the ash. The hut grew dark, and the cold deepened. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the roaring wind outside, and the silent, desperate battle for warmth within. Elara held her brother tight, listening to the shallow rattle of the cow's breath, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening, her pleas mingling with the memory of her father's voice. Hold on. Just until the sun, the night was absolute. And they were giving everything they had to fight it. The longest night of Elara's life was a place without time, a landscape of pure sensation. There was the roaring of the wind, a sound so constant it became a form of silence. There was the crushing weight of the cold, a physical presence that pressed down on the blankets, trying to find its way to their skin. And there was the shuddering, a tremor that started in Finn's small body and spread to her own. An involuntary rebellion of muscles protesting their slow march towards freezing. She focused on the breathing. Finn's was rapid and shallow. Ulrich's was a pained, laborious rasp. And Maeve's was the sound that held all of their fates. It was a faint, wet rattle, a sound so fragile that Elara found herself holding her own breath to hear it, terrified that each exhale would be the last. She had staked everything on this gamble. Her father's pragmatism warred in her mind with her mother's hope. The pragmatist screamed that she was a fool, that she was draining her family's life force into a vessel that was already broken. She was trying to warm a mountain of ice with 3 candles. The cold from Maeve's huge body was relentless, a constant drain. Elara could feel the heat being pulled from her own back, from Finn's small frame. It was an active, hungry cold. You are killing them, the voice of Reeve Morwen whispered in her mind. The village can't carry the dead weight of the dying. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the voice away. She focused instead on her father's other words. We must remember, what had he meant? Remember the cold? No. Remember each other. Remember that the hearth was not just the fire in the center of the hut. The hearth was them. The family. The herd. A circle of warmth, however small. They were not 3 separate souls fighting the cold, they were one. She began to talk, her voice a low murmur against Finn's hair. She didn't know if anyone could hear her over the storm. She didn't care. She talked to keep the despair at bay. Do you remember the summer, Finn? She whispered. The long grass by the river. We made crowns from the daisies. She felt a faint nod from his head. Maeve was there, she continued, her voice growing a little stronger. She was watching us. She ate your crown, remember? Silly cow. She talked about the autumn, about helping her father bring in the small harvest. She talked about the taste of the first apples, sharp and sweet. She painted pictures with her words, trying to build a fire of memory to fight the physical cold. Her words were for Finn, for Ulrich, but most of all, they were for herself. They were a shield against the voice that told her she was failing. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was only minutes. The cold had a way of stretching time into a thin, brittle thread. Her own body had stopped shivering. She knew this was a dangerous sign. It meant her body was giving up, conserving the last of its energy for its vital organs. A strange sense of peace began to settle over her, a dangerous lethargy. It would be so easy to just sleep. To let the darkness take her. It was a cough that saved her. A deep, racking cough from Ulrich. The effort seemed to tear through him, but it was a sound of life, a protest. It broke the spell of her apathy. She couldn't give up. Not while he was still fighting. Not while Finn was still breathing against her chest. She focused her will again, turning it into a physical force. She imagined their warmth, their life, not as a candle but as a forge. She pushed it out, directing it towards the great, cold mass beside them. Live, she thought, the word a silent scream in her mind. Live, you stubborn beast. Live, She didn't know when the change happened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The rattle in Maeve's breathing, was it fainter? The deep, leaching cold from her body, had it lessened, just a fraction? Then she felt it. A tremor. Not a shiver of cold, but a deep, muscular shudder that ran through the cow's entire frame. It was followed by another. Maeve shifted her immense weight, a movement so slight it was barely noticeable, but it was the first voluntary movement she had made all night. A long, deep breath shuddered through the cow's body. It was not the wet rattle of before. It was a sigh. A breath of life. Hope, fierce and sharp as a blade, lanced through Alara's lethargy. She pressed closer, straining her ears over the howl of the wind. She listened. And she heard it. A new sound. A slow, deep, rhythmic breathing. It was weak, but it was steady. The storm did not know of their small victory. It continued its assault, unabated. The long night wore on. Just as cold, just as dark. But something fundamental had shifted within the small, fragile walls of the hut. The slow march towards death had been halted. The three small flames had not been extinguished by the mountain of ice. They had warmed it. They had held the line. Alara did not sleep. She lay there, a human shield against the cold, and listened to the 4 heartbeats in the dark, her own included. She listened until the roar of the wind began to lose its edge, until the impenetrable blackness against the hide flap began to soften into a bruised, weary gray. The dawn, when it finally came, was not a triumph. It was a surrender. The wind sighed, its fury spent, and a profound, exhausted silence fell over the world. A pale, watery light filtered into the hut, illuminating a scene of devastation and survival. The floor was dusted with snow. The fire was dead ash. They were alive. Alara stirred, her limbs stiff and aching as if she'd been beaten. Every muscle screamed in protest. She slowly, carefully, untangled herself from Finn and Alric. They were both deeply asleep, their faces pale and gaunt but their breathing even. She crawled on hands and knees to Maeve's head. She laid a hand on the cow's neck. It was no longer burning with fever. Nor was it deathly cold. It was cool, but it was the coolness of a living thing. As she watched, Maeve's great, long-lashed eyes opened. They were no longer glazed and distant. They were clear. They looked at Alara, and in their depths, she saw not just life, but a calm, bovine recognition. Maeve let out a low, soft sound, a rumble deep in her chest. She lifted her head, just an inch, and nudged Alara's hand with her wet nose. Tears. Hot and sudden, welled in Alara's eyes and traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of grief or fear. They were tears of an exhaustion so profound and a relief so immense that her body had no other way to express it. They had done it. They had faced the longest night and had won. The blizzard was over. The fever had broken. They had survived. She got to her feet, moving like an old woman, and went to the dead hearth. Kneeling in the ash, she took their last few splinters of kindling. With numb, clumsy fingers, she arranged them into a tiny pyramid. She blew on the embers, her breath a prayer. For a moment, nothing. Then, a single, tiny ember glowed a little brighter. She blew again, gently, patiently, coaxing it. A wisp of smoke appeared. And then, a tiny, fragile, beautiful flame sprang to life. The heart of their home was beating again. The day that followed was one of quiet, aching convalescence. The world outside was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow that muffled all sound and reflected the weak sunlight with a blinding intensity. Inside the hut, the air was still frigid, but the tyranny of the wind was over. The small, new fire crackled bravely, a defiant splash of color and sound in the gray stillness. Alara moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. Every part of her body hurt, a deep, cellular ache from the prolonged cold and tension. She gave what little water they had to Alric and Finn, then broke the ice in the bucket to give some to Maeve. The cow drank, her thirst deep and long. It was the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. Sight_start, later, she made a thin gruel from a handful of their remaining oats, Sight. 3:13, it was watery and tasteless, but it was warm, and as she, Finn, and Auric huddled by the fire, spooning the meager meal from a single wooden bowl, it felt like a feast. Finn, recovered from his terror, was full of questions. "Did we make Maeve better with our blankets?" he asked, his eyes wide. "We did," Alara said, managing a small smile. "We kept her warm. Because we're her family." "Yes. Finn. Because we're her family." Auric said little, but he watched Alara with a new look in his eyes. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He saw his son in her now, not just in her looks, but in her spirit. He saw the same unyielding core of strength that had always defined their bloodline. The victory, however, was fragile, and the evidence of their struggle was all around them. The blackened wall was a constant, ugly reminder of their brush with disaster. Their store of fuel was gone. Their food was perilously low. The snow, while beautiful, was a prison, cutting them off from the forest and any chance of gathering more wood. They had survived the battle, but the war of winter was far from over. That afternoon, a figure appeared, trudging through the deep snow. It was Reeve Morwen. He was making his rounds, a grim accounting of the storm's toll on the village. Alara saw him coming and her heart hardened. She stood in the doorway of her hut, blocking his view, her arms crossed over her chest. She would not show him their weakness. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the hut, lingering on the ugly, frozen patch of mud and dung on the wall. He looked at Alara, at her gaunt, soot-stained face and the fierce, defiant light in her grey eyes. "The storm took old Manon," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, an entry in winter's ledger. His roof gave way. Alara said nothing. She just stared at him, her silence a wall he could not breach. Morwen's gaze shifted, trying to peer past her into the darkness of the hut. "Your animal?" he asked. The question clipped. "Did it?" Before Alara could answer, a sound came from within the hut. It was a low, gentle rumble, the sound of a contented cow chewing her cud. It was a sound of life, of normalcy, of impossible survival. From behind Alara, a puff of warm, steamy breath plumed into the freezing air. Morwen's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his mask of cold authority. He stared at the steam, then back at Alara's impassive face. He could not reconcile what he was seeing and hearing with what he knew. This household, the weakest link, should have been broken. The dying animal should be dead. He opened his mouth to say something, then seemed to think better of it. There were no words for this. His rigid, practical calculus of survival had been proven wrong. He had left them to die, and they had refused. With a curt, almost imperceptible nod that might have been respect, or might have been mere dismissal, he turned and continued his grim patrol, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. Alara watched him go, feeling no sense of triumph, only a deep, quiet affirmation. She had not defeated him. She had simply endured. She had proven that strength was not just about hoarding resources and cutting off the weak. It was about shared warmth. About desperate gambles, about the stubborn refusal to let the light go out, no matter how small it became. She stepped back inside the hut and closed the hide flap, shutting out the cold white world. She went to Maeve's side and ran a hand over her flank. The burn was still there, but it was clean. The cow nudged her hand, a silent thank you. Alara looked at her sleeping brother and her grandfather, who was now carving a small piece of wood by the fire. The winter was not over. There would be more cold nights, more hungry days. The struggle would continue. But something inside Alara had been forged anew in the crucible of that long, dark night. The self-doubt that had haunted her was gone, burned away by the fire and frozen out by the blizzard. She had been tested to the absolute limit of her strength and had not been found wanting. She had faced down the cold, the storm, and the casual cruelty of men, and had held the line. She looked at her father's empty stool by the fire. She was no longer just his daughter, trying to live up to his memory. She was Alara, head of her household, keeper of the flame. And she was ready for the next sunrise.